If you give them an inch, they're going to demand a mile. So don't give in. Go like your dad did.
Every second week, Assad would have another meeting that would be live cast, and he'd say, "Okay, these are the reforms I'm putting on the table," and it was "Shab yurid isqat an-nizam," the people want you to go.
And then the regime either kept a blind eye or actively, right behind the scenes, started allowing them to acquire arms. So Hezbollah were involved from the get-go.
And it also is the moment where it's very clear that the opposition has been hijacked, that the opposition is fragmented, that there's no hope anymore.
The Palestinians killed inside Yarmouk camp were more than anything up until Gaza that Israel had killed in its entire wars. Excuse me, Ashfaaq, you were accusing tankies of understanding anything but this? Western media, analysts, pundits saying, oh, it's too complicated. Began with people started meddling from the outside. It didn't start with the indigenous part of the revolt, because that was really clear. People wanted Assad out.
You heard all of this, right, Jamal?
Yeah, well, I heard I need to clap, so I will.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Jamal. Thanks for the clap. On my side, 3, 2, 1, we're good to go. Hi, welcome back to Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaaq Carim, and today with me is Gamal Mansour. Jamal is a Syrian-Palestinian. He's a PhD candidate. He's based out of Toronto, and he's been studying. We've just been discussing just beforehand just how exactly, what specifically he's been studying. He's been studying business, autonomy, and relations with the state in the two Assad regimes, specifically regarding sort of defections and how business was trying to keep itself alive amidst the sanctions and the brutality of the Assad regime. Welcome on the show, Gamal Mansour.
Thank you for having me, Ashfaaq.
Thanks, Jamal. It's going to be a very long discussion. There's a lot to unpack about Syria. The war was 13 years. We're going to be discussing the war to a large extent. We're going to be discussing the liberation, the revolution, and what's ahead. We're also going to be discussing how the revolution has been perceived by many non-Syrians on the left, and why that is the way it is. The challenges of the state, and also, I mean, this is all couched in not just the civil war, but the Arab Spring that kind of gave an uprising to that, and Assad's reign over 50 years.
Okay.
Awesome. Good. So firstly, Jamal, how do you feel about what's happened?
I mean, it's hard to escape. We're two brown dudes, so hyperbole comes naturally to us, but I'm trying to tone the hyperbole down. I'm elated. I am walking on clouds. Ashfaaq. I'm 52 years old right now, so I'm old for the PhD game. It's my second wind at academia. However, I've lived all my life under an Assad in power. The regime that Assad's father created in 1970 predates me by 2 years. I lived all my life going to school, peered down the walls by an Assad picture or poster, some of his sayings plastered all over the walls, effigies and like statues of Assad splintered all over town in Damascus and any major city you go, even on the highways, right? When the revolution broke, I never thought that this was going to be as brutal as it turned out to be, which we're going to discuss in a sec. And I was forced to leave and reconcile myself to the potentiality and then the eventuality that this was going to be a very long-term, if not a permanent state of affairs, that I can never go back. So because the Assad regime was so firmly entrenched in power. And now all of a sudden, all of this is gone in a puff of smoke. I cannot bring myself to say anything, but I'm elated, really.
We're going to go into the genesis of the uprising before the civil war, and we're also going to speak, but just try to locate your context. So when did you leave, yes, how you left, everything else. But before we get there, I don't think this has actually been done enough, but just take a moment to think about the scale of this war, right? Most estimates put the death toll between 500,000 and 600,000. For context, right now in Gaza, about 50 to 60,000 confirmed deaths, maybe up to 250,000 based on the Lancet letter on indirect deaths. We've seen the devastation play out there, not as much as we saw the devastation in Syria. Correct. 14 million refugees. 7 million who went to Europe or Turkey or Jordan outside of Syria, and 7 million internally displaced. I mean, when the Syrian revolution started, when Gaddafi was still in power, right? It was before Brexit. It was before the massive rise of the right in Europe. That, I mean, was probably festering, but we hadn't yet seen. It was before Donald Trump became the president of the USA. And you study this stuff, so you know about this, and you're Syrian, and you've moved to Canada. So just try to, from your perspective, spell out just how significant what's occurred is in terms of not the revolution, but the war and the impact of the war.
I mean, as you just said, I can't really add much. I can add experiential understanding and a perspective, but it is as massive as you said. This was the first time in this region, at least, since the great upheaval of 1918 and the introduction of the Sykes-Picot agreement that basically created all these nation states, that this amount of upheaval, in 1948, when my grandparents and my parents were kicked out of Palestine to establish the state of Israel, that this amount of human suffering and human displacement and demographic change and crimes against humanity were committed at such an unprecedented scale in a certain geographical location. So it was massive in that sense. The type of demographic change, I'll tell you this in an anecdotal manner. Now, wherever I go in Europe, from Norway in the north to Italy in the south, I can find a good Syrian shawarma store. That's saying much. Syrians are dispersed all over the planet right now. We were travelers and open to the outside world, but not at this scale. You can find a Syrian anywhere, and living, working, having a community around them. This is the scale of the dispersion, and we're only talking about the refugees and the people who were forced to leave on their own volition outside Syria. As you said, internally displaced, you have a massive amount of people who are now removed from their ancestral homes and also deprived of means of living in a very rundown economy, as it were, before the war, because of the disparities. Now it's even worse. So it's a massive upheaval, politically speaking, humanitarianly speaking, economically speaking, ecologically speaking. I mean, you can only start to scratch the surface if we want to talk about the impact of this.
Okay, so there's, again, I want to stay on this and not just talk about the refugee and sort of crisis and everything that came from that, because honestly, it's a separate discussion. It's many discussions. There's so much to it. Just anecdotally from myself, I've lived in Turkey for, not now, but previously for about 7 years. And I remember arriving in Istanbul in 2016 and seeing Syrian refugees in many places.
Yes.
And how the Turkish society became more xenophobic and nationalistic and anti-Syrian, and I mean, it was in the elections, it was always a big deal. The opposition made up numbers. There's 10 million Syrians here. We need to throw them back, and this was a big deal. And I mean, yes, the blessing was there was really good Syrian food in many parts of Istanbul. But I mean, it's a very intimate story, and I get that. The other thing is also ISIS, while it came from Iraq, was born because of the Syrian civil war. Which to a large extent, I mean, when Netanyahu started to bomb Gaza, he said he called Hamas ISIS, right? And so, I mean, there's this, and I think we sometimes underplay just how much global Islamophobia was caused during this war as well, as a result of what happened in the war.
You speak Arabic, and I'm going to say something in Arabic and translate it immediately, but ISIS is something that we call in Syrian Arabic, jism al-abis. It means it has a fitting form, meaning, in that sense, ISIS is a very good coat hanger. Whatever you want to hang on ISIS or Islamism or terrorism, you can find a good player and just hang your coat on there and say, hey, all I'm doing is fighting terrorism, right? So ISIS was a helpful tool to kind of radicalize some people, but also create the situation in which you're not bombing civilians, you're bombing terrorists. You're not doing damage to society to keep yourself in power. You're fighting terrorism. You're part of a noble, ideal kind of fight against some radicalized, atavistic, backwarded, dark, malevolent force. I mean, and while you're doing it, like when you make an omelet, you need to crack a few eggs. So a few civilians died. This is the kind of narrative that was being sold on behalf of the Syrian regime by some of, European, either extreme left or extreme right players, as we're going to speak about it. But also in the media, there was this kind of like trepidation of mentioning sometimes the scale of the destruction or the amount of malevolence, again, that is involved in it. Because it was, it is too complex. I mean, there are terrorists. I mean, they have, dark skin and really long beards and they want to apply Sharia. So whose side do we stand on, right? So ISIS was formed in Iraq, as you said. It became the superstar it became after going to Syria, right? Because it was a useful tool. It was not created by, I'm not suggesting some dark room in the CIA, as many tankies would like to say. There were some indigeneities involved in this, but the fact that it was propped up as such was regional players using it as a useful tool to hide behind it to say, hey, we're not doing bad here. It's the baddies we're getting at, right? So yeah, ISIS is kind of that to me.
Yeah, no, excellent. I mean, I think when we speak about this, we're also going to speak about how there's a genesis in unleashing this radicalism that actually starts from Assad himself. But we'll get to that.
Yes.
Okay, so now, for the context of our listeners and our viewers, you've mentioned a bit about your history and how your family moved from Palestine. I introduced you as Palestinian-Syrian. Just give us a sense of locate me in the story before we start the story. Mm-hmm. Locate yourself, I mean, in the story before we start the story.
So my parents were forced out of Palestine in 1948. My father was 6. He was originally a native of Haifa. And my mother was 3 months old and was a native of Jaffa, Tel Aviv right now. My mother's family went to Jordan and my father's family went to Syria. They met at university in Damascus in the 1960s. Myself, I was born in Germany because my father was a dental surgeon and he was doing his specialty. Came back to Syria as a 7-year-old, lived all my life from 7 to 40 in Syria, in Damascus, in an upscale suburb called Abu Rammani. If you know Damascus, you know. So I didn't live in a refugee camp. My parents were upper middle class. I went to a very nice private school. I had friends from the Syrian bourgeoisie, but also the state bourgeoisie. I have friends, well, former friends, obviously now. After the revolution, there was no relationship between us. One of whom was a general in the 4th Armored Brigade, imagine, responsible for the siege of Ma'adamiyeh on the outskirts of southern Damascus. So I went to an upscale school. I had very extensive relations in Syria. I worked in business. I had studied law but never worked as a lawyer. I worked in business and marketing, in business development, company management, and so on and so forth. So I was also kind of immersed with the marketplace in Syria in several aspects, but also the state bureaucracy, because you could never escape it. So I lived an extensive life, went to all around Syria on business trips, lived in Deir ez-Zor for a year and a half, managing the paper mill, the state-owned paper mill that was run by a private equity company. I was part of that. So I also lived outside Damascus and saw for myself in 2007, 2008, the extent of the neoliberal reforms that were basically destroying the economic fabric of Syria, as it were. I was part of a privileged class. Although I didn't belong to that, Syria is, at the end of the day, another Middle Eastern society, family, pedigree, networks of families, intermarriage, etc., belonging to a certain city. If you were a Damascene, that gave you certain kind of access and privilege. And there was this kind of, I was an outsider in that sense. I'm a Palestinian, so I don't have a large extended clan in Damascus. Still, I was always, a Damascene in the sense, if you listen to my Arabic in a dialect, it's not a Palestinian dialect, which a lot of Palestinians in Syria maintain. I'm a very Damascene kind of guy. I integrated in that sense. As part of this Damascenehood, but also my social and economic class, everyone around me almost either stayed silent because they were too afraid or too afraid for their interests. Or they were, some of them were pro-regime or based from the regime's inner circles. I belong to a minority of that class, which is in itself not a huge chunk of the demographics, right? That actually actively said, you know what, I couldn't care less. What is right is right. This is a regime that is bad for Syria. This is a moment of truth, and we have to have effective change, right? So being part of that, I put myself in an unnecessary danger at the moment, it seemed, and kind of led to my own dispossession in a sense, because I couldn't stay in Syria, because if I had, I would have put myself and my family in mortal danger. Or I had to move out and then take the risk of not being able to return, which I did. So the me in this is someone who, by choice, chose to stick to the out of my comfort zone into, and I'm not saying that I have any kind of courage or role in this. It's a personal choice, and the revolution for me gave me that privilege. It gave me that privilege to be able to take the right position on this, and kind of pay for it. And I paid much less than anybody you can imagine, but then be vindicated in this. So that's for me the me in this, really.
So, I mean, specifically, I'm guessing you leave Syria in 2012, just after the uprising begins, or is it sooner or later?
January 13th, 2012 was the last day in Syria for me, yes.
Okay, and I'm guessing you have plans to go back now quite soon, at least to visit.
I packed all my old clothes because I was going to throw them away and be back in 6 months celebrating in Umayyad Square. That's how I thought. That's how naive my mind was.
So going back to January 20, so you thought, I mean, that's interesting, what you want to say, because I'm going to now speak about what happened in Daraa, but the truth is that was actually quite realistic, going back to 2012, which we'll deal with in a while. So now let's go to March. First, I mean, more or less, it's probably about the first 2 weeks of March in Daraa, when Hamza Khatib and Mohammed Ghiath and Tamer al-Shar'i and others write on the wall, Ijaka al-Doctor. It's now your turn, doctor, right? When that happened, or when you got news of when that happened, just what was your reaction and what was happening around you, and what can you recall from that moment?
A few weeks prior to that, a friend of mine and myself took off to the top of Qassim Mount to celebrate the fall of Hosni Mubarak. And he asked me, is it going to be our turn? Will it happen in Syria? And I said, it's impossible. These people are too strong. And people here now have been subjugated to the Hama lesson in 1982 when Hafiz al-Assad destroyed half of Hama when it rose against him, that people are too scared to touch this. A few weeks later, I was eating my words. And the moment that the first demonstration broke in Daraa on March the 18th, I had been working for a fashion company that was, we had located an agent in Daraa. And they were supposed to open their store, like the grand opening, and we were supposed to go, myself and my marketing assistant, to Daraa to celebrate the opening of that. And I went to my manager and said, hey, do you need anything from us? We're going to Daraa. He said, what are you going to do in Daraa? And I was like, the agent is going to open their store. He said, there's no agent, there's no opening stores. Have you not been watching the news? And I was like, no. And he turns Al Jazeera to me, and there's news about demonstrations breaking out in Daraa. I couldn't hide my smile. I was so excited that this was happening. I couldn't believe it, right? And then me and a bunch of other friends and like every other Syrian were just giggling, like openly on the street, that this is happening in Syria right now. Oh my God, right? And then all of a sudden, when you were sitting in cafes in Damascus, Ashfaaq, I don't know if you visited Damascus before. I can't remember.
I have. I lived there in 2007.
Okay, so you know a Rauda cafe in the middle of Damascus, just in front of Parliament, right? This was our go-to, our hangout. And we would sit, there would be a secret policeman that is not secret. Everybody knew who he was. He would be peering from his table at everybody else and watching, glancing at what we spoke. We would be speaking in hushed tones, and he knew that he was intimidating us. After March the 18th, for 6 or 7 months, the psychological dread reversed. We were speaking openly, looking at him, and he was cowering in his table, like, just don't, please, do whatever you want. So for a moment in time, for like 6 to 7 months, all of a sudden there was politics. There was this momentum on the street. People were not afraid to speak out. People were not afraid to voice their because the regime had not started in earnest. They were confused, and they didn't know how to react, and they wanted to buy some time and kind of placate everyday Syrians for a while, at least in the major cities as Damascus and Aleppo, because they were thinking the Sunnis of those cities they can kind of co-opt. So we were like, all of us were kind of elated talking politics. All of a sudden, it was no longer a taboo to speak about things, and we could say things that we always kept in mind out in the open without fear. So yeah, it was an exciting, exhilarating time.
Okay, I mean, I just want to also locate for our audience just what was to get a sense of the euphoria, right? I mean, it wasn't. I think we often forget this because there's been so much. I mean, until literally 2 weeks ago, there's been so much of a rollback of the various Arab revolutions. Mm-hmm. But at the time, right, so March 18th is when this demonstration occurs. In Egypt, on March 19th, Egypt held its first referendum after Mubarak's resignation to vote on constitutional amendments, right? In Bahrain, on March 16th, the Bahraini government violently cleared the Pearl Roundabout, and by March 14th, which was before that, the GCC forces led by Saudi Arabia entered Bahrain to kind of help thwart the uprising. On March 18th, the same day that you speak about what happened in Daraa, in Yemen, the massacre where 50 people were killed in Sana'a occurs as well. Libya had already almost, actually on March 19th, I just have this note here, NATO began airstrikes, and by March 17th had authorized a no-fly zone that included all necessary measures to protect civilians because Gaddafi's crackdown was in full blow. Mm-hmm. And in Tunisia, things were going well, and that obviously was the catalyst for this. So there was this moment of magic almost. And I remember, because at the time I worked for Jazeera, and you write about that 6-7 months, what would happen is every second week, Assad would have another meeting that would be live cast, and he'd say, okay, these are the reforms I'm putting on the table. And it was Shab Yurid Isqat al-Nizam. The people want you to go. They want the complete change. And I'm saying all of this because my next question is about why and how the civil war started. And I also remember clear footage, and this is now it's being seen again because of the what's occurred and the revolution sort of coming full circle. These chants in Hama and Homs, Sunni wal Alawi wahda, the people were united. And I'm sure you possibly participated in these kind of protests in Damascus themselves. So maybe speak anecdotally to that. But then the question is, how did we get to a civil war?
Okay, so let me just start by telling you, this was so when the revolution broke on March 18th, it was only on a Friday that the revolution, demonstrations would start, right? The only reason being, in Syria, every public space was constricted. You could not meet. There was, under martial law, there was an actual part of martial law that prohibited more than 3 people standing together on the street. This, if they saw a group of 3 people, they would normally let people go and not do it. But they had the right by martial law to frisk, arrest any group of more than 3 people standing on the street. So there was no public space where you can move, demonstrate, stand in front of anything without being subjected to, either soft coercion or even worse. The only place where people could actively meet was, for the majority of the population who happened to be Sunni, were mosques. So demonstrations would go out after Friday prayers, and a lot of people like myself who were not particularly religious. We would stand on the corners of these mosques outside waiting for people to get out of their prayers and then join and go on a demonstration. So for a couple of weeks, there were these demonstrations in Syria on the streets, not demanding the removal of the regime, as a matter of fact. They were demanding some kind of freedom, freedoms, democracy, reforms, etc. Because the idea was, we don't want to go into a Gaddafi-style kind of mess, number one. We've seen Iraq as well next to us, and we didn't want to go into an Iraqi scenario. The other thing was, there was still people entertained a bit of hope that the president himself is hemmed in by his father's men and the security apparatus. That we as people, if we go out and show that we're, with him, asking him to reform only, not go into like full-scale change and stuff, that he would have the opportunity to bypass these men. There was still some kind of faith that he is different, right? So people were trying to give him a chance. Now, after the second week of demonstrations, both Farouk Shara, the former foreign minister and deputy, vice president, and Buthaina Shaban, his factotum, translator, and kind of spokesperson, went out on media, started saying that President Assad is going to go out, speak to the Syrian people. He's going to make everything, that is possible to reform, blah, blah, blah. And they were raising people's expectations. On March the 30th, he went to parliament. So there was a lot of talk on the streets in Damascus, and the people who know, but also through official and non-official sources, spreading the gospel that he's going to go and apologize to the people of Daraa, that he's going to take the muhafiz, the governor, and the head of the security in Daraa, who basically insulted the people coming to his office to seek their kids, and said, "What kids? You don't have any kids. Forget about your kids. Go make new ones. And if you can't make new ones, send your wives to us, and we will help them do that." That's how insulting this guy was. This guy, the head of security in Daraa, was Assad's maternal cousin, right? So there was this demand to have him removed, and some kind of promise of reforms. When he went in front of Parliament, all he said was conspiracy, U.S. sources, Israelis on the pay, terrorists, blah blah blah, and the story that you know. So this is when the chants on the next Friday went from reforms and democracy and having faith in the president to removal. And the more these chants began to highlight the failings of the president and wanting him to be removed and wanting the regime to be removed, the more coercive he became. The level of low-intensity violence, like police coercion, went to harsher and harsher and harsher measures until early 2012, when it started to become closing off entire city blocks, going house-by-house searches, becoming more and more violent, taking more people in, disappearing them, until in July, I think, 2012, there was this bombing, this mysterious bombing of the head of the crisis management cell, which was a cell of all the regime security chiefs, including his brother-in-law, Asif Shokat, the husband of his elder sister, Bushra, who were meeting in this most secure building, in the most secure part of town, That was cordoned off. There were no traffic allowed, etc., etc. And then a tiny little explosive device, very local, that didn't even shatter the glass in the buildings surrounding that building, right? Just killed the people inside this crisis management cell. And the regime used that as, Maher al-Assad, Bashar's brother, who's the head of the crack 4th Division, was part of that crisis cell. He was supposed to chair that meeting. Conveniently, he didn't make it to that meeting. Everybody else was dying or injured out of that, and he escaped unscathed somehow. And they used this excuse to go on full-scale bombing of entire neighborhoods. That's when Yarmouk camp, for example, started being bombed from Qasiyun Mau. That's when, Homs started being bombed, and so on and so forth. So I think, to me, as an observer, the moment that it went from low level to high level policing, neighborhood action, etc., into full scale lopsided civic war from the state against the population, using all the tools of war, basically supposedly against Israel, amassed against Israel, against the population, is in mid 2012, and the reason being is there was a decision at the core of the regime, like the family itself, the Assad family, and the few close advisors, Mohammad Nasif, the head of internal security, Mohammad al-Khawli, who used to be head of Air Force intelligence, which was one of the most notorious, remains one of the most notorious intelligence services in terms of brutality, in terms of coercion, in terms of disappearing people, who is no longer the head of that, but now a presidential security advisor as well, right? Who basically told him, if you give them an inch, they're going to demand a mile. So don't give in. Go like your dad did, right? Full scale, kind of show them who's boss. And they basically told him to back himself into a corner and fight until the last man. And that's I think, in my opinion, based on what I know, is how this escalated into a civil war. Now, obviously, when you're fighting against people, they're going to have to fight back, and then a lot of external players are going to make, use of that and take advantage and start arming. And that's how it got into the conflict that we know. But it's not complicated like it's told in stories of people in the West, basically, who want to say, I really don't like either one, and I'm not interested, so I'm going to say it's too complicated. It's not. It's a lopsided story of a regime that found itself backed in a corner, could not institute reforms because reforming means, putting the whole house down, and it said to itself, you know what, I'm going to fight until the last man.
I mean, I do agree with you. It's not as complicated as the media and the West and pundits like to make it out. But let's try to now go through sort of the stages of the war and simplify it, right, for our audience.
Go for it.
So I mean, I think the best place to start off with is the defections from the actual Syrian army that sort of start the Free Syrian Army, just who they were. Mm-hmm. But then also and then also Assad sort of releasing extremists who will start creating exactly what you said, a narrative for him to speak the language of the West about terrorism, to sort of now crack down and justify it. And it's after that kind of, they kind of reach a stalemate there that then foreign actors start coming over, and even there's more infiltration from Al-Qaeda and what was previously became ISIS, but was the Islamic Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? But before we get to that, let's just talk about the defections. Mm-hmm. And how the situation was kind of used by Assad, and how close to, even in 2013 and 2014, the Free Syrian Army was actually to freeing Syria before actors then came in and made it more complex.
Right. So defections started with people basically taking personal initiatives in they belonged to certain villages or towns that were starting to being targeted harshly, especially in the Hawran region in southern Syria and southwestern Syria, where Daraa is the main city. These tiny little towns around Daraa, but Daraa itself, were the first ones, as well as in the northwest around Idlib region, where people hailing from these communities who happened to be in the military. And we're talking about mid to low level defections. There were not a lot of people in the beginning of higher rank, colonels and the like, that were defecting. You have to also understand that military security in Syria is very, very tight. Now, Syria, in terms of like military intelligence versus external, like as any military intelligence would be, like, you know, spying on enemies or keeping enemies from spying upon the country, was porous. There was not a lot of interest or investment in any kind of externality being dangerous. The gaze and the control was against the military staff themselves. Every general, every lieutenant, every member who was a non-conscript, like a professional military person, was assigned at least one minder that would write reports about their everyday moves. They were, you know, in a kind of 1984 Big Brother. Everybody in Syria was like that. 1984 should have been written about Syria under Assad. I think I'm again, hyperbole aside. This was North Korea on the Mediterranean with a nicer face and a more modern looking guy with some openness to foreigners. But in essence, the way that it was run was a North Korean style kind of tightness. So the people who defected were of middle to lower rank at the beginning and did this on their own volition as a part of defending their clan or making a personal kind of choice. Some of whom were to regret, like the first known defector, Harmouche, was disappeared and killed in the prison gulag. It was also to be made, like he was made an example so that no one else defects. It did the other way around. It actually had a reverse effect on them. And then the defections started to increase and accumulate until in 2012, when the regime started its active war against entire civilian populations that people were forced to like leave en masse and create, because there was the Free Syrian Army in itself is a nice name. But in reality, there was no unified command that had hierarchical control over every defecting bunch of soldiers or officers. These were in reality localized factions that just pledged allegiance to say, we're not the Syrian army under the regime, we are a Free Syrian Army. But in reality, was there a structure of a Free Syrian Army? I can tell you with a good deal of certainty there wasn't. Even when there became kind of like a sort of like superstructure of a bunch of officers, in reality they did not have like the command control structure that a normal army would have. So the Free Syrian Army was just made up of defectors, and the fact of the matter was, up until 2015, almost 60% of what was the Syrian army had defected. The Syrian regime was left in terms of like a coordinated structure, with in reality the special forces and the 4th Armored Brigade, which was the Republican Guard, whose task was really to defend the regime, like the president, his own office, and, you know, the capital city. So these defections took place organically in a sense, and then started to be accelerated when foreign players, each to their own, you know, interests, started to, you know, arm, train, or finance, or a mixture of all of these newly formed defectors.
Okay, so now let's deal a bit with that, and let's just, I mean, give us your understanding, because, I mean, obviously there's layers here, right? Because not all of us are privy to all of the information that's out there, because it's a civil war situation, and who knows what's going on. There's not a lot of reporting on this. There's a lot of rumor, a lot of hearsay, all of these things. But just what is your understanding of how this sporadic group of defectors then sort of get evolve, or just not even evolve, but there's new participants in the form of militias. Eventually there's Hezbollah, there's militias from Iran, there's fighters who are anti-Iranian and pro-Sunni, but come from Iraq and are not indigenous to Syria. They get mixed with members of the FSA. So I mean, while it's simple in its essence, it does become complicated. And there's funding from Saudi Arabia, there's funding from Qatar, there's eventually U.S. involvement and eventually Russian involvement. So
Correct.
just in the most simple way, just try to. And there's also, I mean, which we haven't really addressed in the previous question.
Yes.
Assad sort of allowing the extremist elements of this resistance, initially at least, to kind of gain an upper hand amongst the resistance. So let's start with that.
Can I
start with that.
Okay. So the first thing we need to know, Assad has sold himself to the world as a secular regime, right? This is a secular regime that is dead set against Islamism specifically, but Islamic jihadism as well. It was demonstrating itself as part of the war on terror globally after 9/11, and so on and so forth. When the Americans invaded Iraq, the regime panicked. And all of a sudden, it had trained under Iranian advising. It started to train local elements of wannabe jihadis who were either imprisoned before because of their Islamist leanings, or were just, kind of cropped from among Syrian youth, especially from peripheral cities outside Damascus, usually, and groomed to become fighters, jihadis against the American invaders in Iraq. In this manner, Assad managed to do several things, to hit several birds with one stone. Fight the Americans and make them drown in their own problems in Iraq, and thereby stop them from invading him, because that was the sound that was coming at the time. He was afraid for himself, but also at the same time get rid of the jihadis that he had, dump them in Iraq. Now, when the Americans kind of made some pressure on him, he's opened his door back for them, and the moment that they crossed, he had trained them, he had allowed them, he had armed them, right? They came back, he took them and put them in prison. When did he release these people? People like Zahran Aloush, people like other people, right? Zahran Aloush was head of something called Jaysh al-Islam, Islam's army, that was based in Douma on the southern outskirts of Damascus, the largest town in Damascus's countryside at the time. Zahran Aloush was released in prison on April 2011. Defections in the Syrian army had not started happening yet, right? So these people, Assad announced on April the 17th, which was Independence Day from France. This is a national holiday. So he, as part of him saying, hey, I'm reforming too, I'm going to release political prisoners. Now, there's a blogger called Tal al-Malouhi who was imprisoned in 2009 because she had a blog when there were like 4 people in Damascus who would be able to follow blogs, right? Who went to a conference for human rights in Cairo at the time, and upon her arrival was arrested for spying for the CIA or something, right? Imprisoned and kept until 2019. Her sentence should have been ended. She was kept until freed only with the fall of the regime right now. Tal al-Malouhi's biggest crime was being a blogger. She was kept under lock and key, while Zahran Aloush, a known Islamist who was a very supposedly, anti-regime figure, was released under this political detainees freeing goodwill gesture in April 2011. And then the regime either kept a blind eye or actively, right, behind the scenes, started allowing them to acquire arms. Because you needed to prop these elements up, A, to eat away the civic resistance, and to give you the reason for you to fight like tooth and nail against these protesters, because they're all Islamists, they're bad hombres, right? This is how this started. These people were given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. There are lots of testimonies from people throughout the years of the civil war telling you about how regime generals would sell arms, would arm the people who are standing against them so that they continue fighting, because that will give them the opportunity to go ahead and fight again. You needed to prop up the devil that you want to make. And at times it got out of hand. But within the strategy of the regime, as long as you had a credible threat that gave you the opportunity to go in, the most violent direction that you had. And basically, the most people who got the worst treatment were those who did not carry arms. People like Dr. Omar Aziz, for example, who was organizing civic society and giving them, kind of plans, because that's his knowledge and specialty. He came back from France and started to try and organize local committees. He was tortured and killed in prison, while Zahran Alouche was given freedom months before Omar Aziz came back to Syria. So it tells you how the regime's security arm and securitization of relations to Syria and its own self-defense was predicated on allowing the most violent and notorious people in Syrian society who were always on the outskirts of society to be propped up so that you can justify your most coercive and violent response. This is how Islamism started in Syria in its jihadi phase, let alone for the allowing of people coming in from outside, which was helped by other forces from outside Syria, the regime's rivals in Turkey, for example, etc. Now, on the regime's side, Hezbollah, as you were just suggesting, Hezbollah were in Syria as of 2011. I can tell you this on personal knowledge. My cousin, right, is married to a guy who used to be the night manager at a hotel on Damascus International Airport Road. It's a big facility where there's like a big conference setting where, official conferences were set up and, hosted by like dignitaries, etc. An entire floor of that hotel was cordoned off and kept off limits for Iranian experts. Them and their monitoring equipment, them and their, electronic devices, etc., were put on this floor as of February 2011. So there was this Iranian worry that things might go in a bad direction. We need to be prepared. And then these advisors were also kind of instrumental in advising Assad in their own counterinsurgency tactics that they've trained themselves very well in Iraq. You need to create a credible threat or allow a credible threat and then prop it up, as in ISIS, in Syria for you to justify your moves. So it was the internal kind of gut reaction of the regime to do that, because they've been well versed in doing that in Lebanon, for example, for years. And then also the Iranian advice that gave rise to these moves. And then Hezbollah came in at first to help, protect the Adabat al-Muqaddasi, the official religious shrines that were visited by Shia, to protect them against the Islamists and the terrorists. So Sayyida Zainab, who was the granddaughter of Prophet Muhammad, the Shia take particular pride in Zainab and have her as a religious figure. She has a shrine on the southern end of Damascus, and Hezbollah came to protect that against the terrorists. And then this escalated into assisting and abetting the Syrian regime and then taking over Al-Qasir, the city of Al-Qasir near Homs, which was overlooking the Syrian-Lebanese border. This part of the border, since the late 2011 period until early 2012, became outside the regime's control, but also outside the Lebanese state control. It became the unofficial border for Hezbollah fighters, arms going to and from Syria, but also, after all, Captagon and drug trade and, a lot of pillaging and so on and so forth. So Hezbollah were involved from the get-go. It escalated in terms of like the level of that, but they were never kind of outside and were forced to. It was by choice. So foreign fighters started pouring onto Syria as well after these defections in the Syrian army started to become, more serious, and it draining the fighting force outside the Syrian regime, the Iranians started getting, their own assistance. So IRGC, advisors, some fighters, Iraqi militias, Afghani militias, from everywhere around the world, right? To come and assist the regime that was crumbling really in its structure. It's an army that was ill-trained anyways. Badly equipped. The equipment had not been, updated since the late 1980s when the Soviet Union fell. It had no fighting morale, and the fighting morale went down as well after these defections. So the Syrian army really crumbled. The Syrian regime was standing on three legs. One was the security forces. The other was the crack forces that it had, which were few in number but really well trained, but could not spread elsewhere. So they were supported by Shabiha gangs, which were basically local thug militias, which usually had a sectarian composition made out of the regime's own, base in Latakia and Tartus, mainly Alawites, poor Alawites who were, promised looting capacity, but also were driven by fear induced by the regime's propaganda that the Sunnis are going to come and eat you alive. So you need to defend yourself, and you can make a good buck. There's no jobs for you anyways. This is a way to make money, and it's going to be short and sweet anyways. And the Iranians are helping, and then the Iranians plus their militias. This came to a place where even these forces were attritioned to a degree where the regime in 2015 was about to fall. And the Iranians went to the Russians and said, listen, we've reached the end of our tether. If you allow this to happen, this regime's going to fall, and then we both lose. So then the Russians came in. And this was reversed because the Russians came in with their air force and started, if you have air cover with Iranian boots on the ground, you could do wonders, and that's what's happened. So 2015 was the turning point, but they've been involved. All these forces were involved since 2011. Is what I'm saying.
So, I mean, before we get to the Russian air power and how that devastated Syria and in many ways turned the tide for Bashar al-Assad, let's. I mean, we've discussed the composition of the pro-Assad forces. Let's start now unpacking during that period, 2012 to 2015, when the FSA sort of fragments and becomes a bunch of also militias that are quite confusing for someone looking at this from the outside to make sense of. And it's also now a lot of foreign involvement from the side of Gulf states and Turkey. Turkey's concerns are slightly different, and we'll deal with that as well. But yeah, just let's, before we get to the Russians, let's deal with the composition of the other side.
So first of all, let's talk about the motives, right? We have to remember that all of this happened in the context of, or on the coattails of, the Arab Spring. Regimes in the Gulf region were understandably unhappy and scared about the Arab Spring. This is destabilizing for these regimes that have their own reasons for wanting not to have popular revolts. So a success of popular revolts in the Levant region, but also in Egypt, were threatening because it might give people the wrong idea. Bahrain too was a warning call. So these countries, for their own reasons, wanted to kind of either stem the tide or control it, each to their own advantage, in the places where this was happening. So Syria was one. That's number one. Number two, they had these internal rivalries between them. So the Saudi-Qatari rivalry, the Saudi-Emirati rivalry against Qatar, each also using their other regional alliances, all of them wanting to contain Iran. So this was where the mess was starting. This is where people say it's confusing. The local indigenous level was affected by these external rivalries because people who rose against the regime, the FSA, needed armament, needed support, because the regime had external support from Iran financially. Iran sank $30 billion, which I'm hoping they'll never get back anymore. Throughout the 10 or 15 or 13 years that they were involved in Syria, on the side of a regime. These were financial, but also in kind, arms, and so on and so forth kinds of assistance. The rebels didn't have any of that until the Qataris started financing, the Turks started financing, the Saudis started financing. And this financing did not come to help the Syrians. It was to use the Syrian factions that belonged to you to, keep check on the rival factions that were supported by your rival. So Qatari and Saudi forces would not coordinate with each other because they were given instructions or kind of like using the leverage of money. We won't finance you if you do this, right? So this is where the mess started happening. And this is where all these defections, which started off as an anti-regime only, started being influenced also by the ideological influences of your wannabe supporter. These supporters each had their own inclinations, and they were trying to influence you to go in ahead and declare things that were amenable to them. So this is when it becomes really a complex soup of all these factions with all these weird names. Every guy with a gun plus, a couple of his clan became, a head of a faction, and they didn't even need a TV station. They could have, a YouTube channel, and there you go. You're a defector. You're a general in an army or something, right? This is when it got confusing. The regime, on its own hand, from its own side, gleefully watched this because it could paint the anti-regime revolt as just factionalism, tools of external, kind of meddling. It revalidated the story that Ashfaaq told in 2011 in front of Parliament, that all of this is just everybody hating on us. We're innocent here. We're just defending Syria from all these, influences. The people who came on our side are just assisting us. But it's the Qataris. There was this saying in pro-regime media of al-mu'amara as-Sahyu Qataru Israel Saudi. So Zionist, Qatari, Saudi a conspiracy against the regime. It's just zany how the regime managed to sell that kind of scenario fear to its own people. But there it did. And it was assisted by the kind of mess of these competing external players, each supporting one faction against the other, to the detriment of toppling the regime. Some people, Syrians, not a few, at the time were suspecting that there was this kind of backhanded assistance to the regime by Arab and external players who really wanted the revolution to fail. If they cannot have the revolt go to their own interest against everybody else's interests, then the better is that this continues for a stalemate or it fails, because we want to tell people. And in Arab media, in Saudi media, for example, there was this oft-repeated refrain during the mid-2010s that, look at what the Syrians did to themselves. Do you want to be like the Syrians? Look at how they destroyed their own country. Look at what they've done to themselves. And this is basically a kind of like a not even very well hidden message that don't you dare do this, because you're going to be like the Syrians. So we were made in Syria to be like the problematic child, the cautionary tale, in a sense, by this Arab meddling. And then all of a sudden, when the regime started, reversing its losses with the help of the Russians, everybody wanted to go talk to the Russians. All of a sudden, nobody wanted to coordinate with anybody. People were just left to their own devices, right? So the history of this external meddling, which justified, again, Western media, analysts, pundits saying, oh, it's too complicated, began when people started meddling from the outside. It didn't start with the indigenous part of the revolt, because that was really clear. People wanted Assad out. Pure and simple.
Okay, we again, just for the fuller spectrum, right? Before we start with the Russians, I think, well, it's not the elephant in the room, but I think we need to have a discussion on ISIS and Al-Qaeda and just what happens there. It's precisely because the HTS, who now are the de facto leaders of Syria, do come out of that. And I think if anything, we need to give sort of, that needs an honest discussion that's probably going to be more informing than many people probably think.
Yes.
Right. So just let's deal with that, and then the U.S. involvement it's also their failure. I mean, after the whole chemical attack thing, that it would be a red line, and then Obama did nothing. So there's that aspect, but then the U.S. do get much more involved when ISIS is a real thing, and we're starting to see beheadings on TV, and Baghdadi has declared a caliphate in Raqqa and all of these things after first taking over Mosul. So let's deal with that, and then we're going to come to the Russians.
Okay, so I mean, stability in the Middle East was predicated on regimes that started all in 1969, 1970. Sadat came to power in 1970 after Nasser's death. Saddam Hussein and co. came to power at the end, like the mid of 1968. Assad assumed power in reality, Hafiz al-Assad, the first Assad. In 1969, he only declared it after formalizing his coup in 1970. Ja'far Numeri also in Sudan came to power in 1969, 1970. These regimes overstayed their welcome for a longer period of time. The destabilization of the regional order as it was made, at the détente moment in Soviet-American relations globally, was destabilized when the Americans decided to invade Iraq. And then that started a kind of tumult. People were holding on to power, but it kind of rocked the boat a bit. Then people's revolt happened in 2011, and that opened the door for more destabilization. Inside these regimes, the main active threat, on the surface, everybody was against Israel. So the main cause of the Iraqi regime, the main cause of the Syrian regime, the main cause of every progressive, supposedly Arab regime was, we're for the Palestinian cause against Israel's aggressions. But in reality, inside these societies, the main enemy was Islamism. These were selling themselves as secular, forward-looking, modernizing regimes whose main enemy was atavistic, traditionalist, non-progressive, conservative Islamism. And they created the enemy that they wanted to fight so that they can justify holding on to power. So part of the genesis of ISIS has these indigenous roots inside these societies of people who were marginalized, who were not given enough space to politically protest non-violently, even if on conservative side of affairs, and were forced basically to be pushed into kind of like a more dogmatic and more violent active resistance. Now, they were always on the margins of things. The opening up of Iraq, the meddling of Iran, and the propping up of these disgruntled ex-Ba'athi soldiers, for example, who became part of ISIS's structure, right? Who had training, who had a knowledge of bureaucratic structures, who were actively creating a state. ISIS was a pre-state kind of state structure, was made up of these Iraqi soldiers who were thrown out by Paul Bremer's decision to disband the Iraqi army and were marginalized because they belonged to the Sunni minority, now with the Shiite majority ruling, were made to be, devil incarnate in terms of like crimes of war, etc., etc. There was no justice process that, basically separated people and kind of reintegrated these people into Iraqi society. So what would disgruntled ex-soldiers used to violence, used to being coercive and ruling over things and being deprived of that power now, organized and well-versed into military and bureaucratic, procedures would do. They would carry arms and start organizing themselves and fight against their internal enemy. And then when your neighborhood gets destabilized and people open doors for you just by, walking out, you're going to try and fill that void, right? And then you're dealing with other people who are either abetting you, actively saying you need to go more radical, or you have your own proclivities and you find that people are kind of like leaving you to. Mosul, for example, in Iraq, fell to ISIS. In Iraq, there was a big scandal. Nouri Maliki was accused, still is being accused. Nouri Maliki, the former prime minister, at the time the active prime minister, was being accused by Iraqi politicians, Shia Iraqi politicians, of walking out of Mosul and leaving it unperturbed for the ISIS to take over. So there was this kind of, by omission, by active omission, allowing ISIS to grow into a fighting force. Right? There were also these people who were jihadis, who were on the sidelines of political life in Iraq and Syria, who were actively thrown into, either go to Afghanistan and, good riddance, don't come back. Who, after Afghanistan was freed by the Americans in 2001, right, had nowhere to go, and then went back to Iraq post 2003 or to northern Syria, taken by the regime and kept in prison, and then released, as I said to you in 2011, early on, to create the devil that they wanted. So this dynamic is behind what created or allowed the creation of these forces. And then the general disintegration of the Free Syrian Army in Syria made the most radical elements want to fight in a force that had some oomph to it. ISIS sounded like that because it had a structure, it had a clear and unapologetic purpose, it was coercive and violent, and gave them rise for their revenge, to take place. It also reflected some of their ideological bent, which was not conservative, it was extremist in that sense. So those people went ahead and did bay'ah, pledged allegiance to ISIS. Some of them pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS were out-competing each other in Syria on who's more radical. ISIS turned out to be more radical. Jolani disavowed his any ties to ISIS because of that. And then inside Qaeda, he was not considered radical enough for Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, after Osama bin Laden had been killed. And they fought amongst each other, and he said, that's it, I quit. So am I saying that Al-Jolani was like, kind of like a liberal politician? Of course not. But there are degrees of jihadi Salafism, and these were kind of slow to disintegrate in Syria, and first of all, slow to coalesce and then rise, but also then slow to kind of disintegrate and show their true colors, in a sense, in Syria. So in this sense, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham currently is as close to ISIS as, say, a Shia is to a Sunni. They're not very close. They're an offshoot of that, but they're an offshoot of an offshoot, and they've made some major transformations that would lead to them being actually religiously disavowed by the purists in ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They're not very religious enough for them because they allow things that for ISIS and Al-Qaeda are completely off.
So we've dealt with ISIS. Let's deal with the Americans, right? Because I think it's only fair to talk about the Russian presence in response to there being an American presence as well. I'm not saying the Russians would only have come because the Americans were involved, but it's definitely a factor. So, over to you again.
Listen, I read this a little different than what is... it's fashionable. It's a fad to accuse the Americans of everything under the sun. I'm not a defender of the United States or its foreign policy actions in Syria. As a matter of fact, as a Syrian myself, the part in me that is Syrian actively blames America for not being involved when it ought to have been involved. And I'm going to say how in a second. Obama's red line should not have been proclaimed if it were not to be put in action. Now we know with hindsight that while he was saying there was a red line of the Syrian regime using chemical weapons against his own, like mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction against its population, and then the United States is going to make him pay. While he was doing that, he was actively negotiating with the Iranians for the nuclear deal. He sacrificed the red line over two reasons. First of all, the Americans had overlearned the lesson of Afghanistan and Iraq. Obama came in 2008 because he promised that the Americans were never going to go into these forever wars again. Right? This was on both ends of the aisle. It was a popular thing in the United States. The United States needs to stay out of these conflicts. We need to stop thinking in terms of, like, as Americans, in terms of nation building, etc. We're no longer after World War II. This is not Germany. We're not going to do this, right? So the American establishment actively wanted to not get involved, boots on the ground style, Iraq kind of style, in anywhere, least of all Syria. I can understand that, but there were demands in the first months of the revolution by the civic committees that were, heading the civil unrest and all these demonstrations. There was like this kind of coordinating units that were trying to unify the slogans for each week's demonstrations. And one of these demonstrations was asking for air cover or a no-fly zone from the Assad regime, kind of like what happened in Libya. The Americans never did this, ever. Right? The Americans were not involved in Syria in the terms that the tankies think about. I would tell you, if they had been involved, this would have looked a very different way. As a matter of fact, a large part of what happened in Syria was the attempt by every other regional player, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, even the Iranians, to have the Americans actively involved with boots on the ground and then put this large footprint into a tiny little corner where they can start with 1 million paper cuts hurting them until the Americans said to them, what do you want us to do? And then they can negotiate from a place of strength and ask the Americans to destroy all their rivals for them. This was what the Saudis wanted. This was what the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Iranians actively wanted. And the Americans stayed out. So part of also the mess that these regional players created was to attract the Americans, raise the alarm bells, and allow them to go in force. Everybody except the Syrians were interested in that, obviously. So the Americans stayed out, Ashfaaq. They didn't stay in that sense. They were always overseeing, supervising, playing from afar. I'm not saying they were like completely hands off. But as the involvement that people speak about of the United States in messing about, like this is all an American ploy. I think you need to stop watching too many Hollywood movies. In reality, the Americans were not, the last thing I'm going to say is the Americans were not as actively boots on the ground, hands on, planning, abetting, hating as people make them out to be. As a matter of fact, if anything,
they weren't involved.
They weren't as involved as they could have or should have at certain points been. That would have averted a lot of the destruction that happened. But they were not interested in this. Syria was always and also ran for the Americans. It was never a country that it was important in and of itself. There was no oil in Syria to speak of. The oil in Syria concerns all the parties inside Syria. It's never been exportable. I worked in the oil industry. At the peak of Syria's production of oil in 1998, Syria produced 500,000 barrels per day. That's nothing. That's one maybe or two, oil wells in Saudi Arabia. And it was not of export grade material. It was sulfur rich. It needed a lot of chemical agents to be treated so it became sellable. There was no exportable route that was good enough for external markets. And it was more expensive because of that than other forms of oil. It was running out of production. It was good enough for Syria itself to consume and maybe export to countries nearby if they needed it. So there was no bounty in Syria for the Americans. It was all problems, sects, different ethnicities with inherent problems, with a lot of coercion and violence for years and years and years. It was a bomb waiting to happen. They've learned their lesson in Iraq. They were not going to repeat that for anything in the world. But they made sure by absence at times, or by just nudging a little bit here or a little bit there, and by little bit meaning maybe bombing sometimes, maybe allowing their regional partners to aid someone or withhold aid from someone else, to control the narrative so it remained a dormant or a non-active problem. When it became active, they came in, bombed ISIS, forcefully so, and then said, Bob's your uncle. Enough is enough. We don't want to be involved in this anymore. What about the post-war Syria? Oh, well, we're going to see, etc., diplomatic language and blah, 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 but actively nothing. Under the Biden administration, Ashfaaq, there was no Syria plan. There was no Syria white paper. There was absolutely no interest. The person speaking on behalf of the American administration was a third-level employee at the State Department. This is how much Syria didn't matter. For the past at least 8 years, nobody cared about Syria. After ISIS was taken care of, Syria was just refugee crisis, support Syrians, democracy. But in the United States, Syria was a non-issue. It was left for regional players to figure it out. And Russia, in my opinion, was given a green light by omission by the Obama administration. When Obama went into like a bind where he had to either take action and, really act upon his red line ultimatum or have a way out, Putin gave him a way out. So there was some kind of low-level coordination. They hated each other on many issues, but on Syria, they were kind of playing footsie together, right?
Yeah, no, I do completely agree with you. And I think to a large extent, there wasn't this appetite to get involved after Iran. And Obama also, Iraq. I think, knew that there wouldn't be support from the electorate if he went into Syria.
Iraq.
I think that's... Sorry, Iraq, yeah. My brain said Iraq, but I think my mouth said Iran. So there was that. And also there was this there's a definite concern that the electorate would punish him if he went into Syria. It wouldn't be a good look.
Yes.
But I think, his ignoring of that red line, it allowed Russia not just to intervene, but to intervene in the massive, deadly way it did, which I think in many ways was a test for Ukraine. Because then Russia knew, they also did Crimea, but they could get away with this. This administration, especially with Democrats in charge, weren't going to really push Putin hard in any way. And it's really come full circle, because if Russia didn't get involved in Ukraine, it would be very difficult for HTS to make its run in Damascus. So it's all very interesting. But I do totally agree with you. And
sliding doors moments. And let me tell you this, Ashfaaq. There's another interesting thing that we need to look at. Putin's entire posture of being proactively against the United States, getting into sabotaging elections, getting into, internet trolling and dissemination of false information, the propping of Russia Today, RT, as a media force online, starting to propagate all these lies that eventually helped Trump being elected in 2016. All of this soft powering started happening when Obama in 2011 said in an interview, or 2010, I think Putin was still by then, that also this kind of like musical chairs, because he had 2 terms as president. He couldn't run for the third.
Exactly.
He gave Medvedev the presidency and he was a prime minister. And then there was talk about Russia and its role in Syria, et cetera, and like a global posture. And Obama basically derisively said, Russia is a has-been. He didn't say it in so many words, but like Russia is now like a middling power. It needs to punch in its own weight. And that pissed off Putin, excuse my French, royally. It's kind of like the unofficial story being told in media about the moment that Putin started to become very actively aggressive against the United States in that sense. Putin was raking up low-level, soft power wins that increased his stature globally because of the areas where the United States was receding. He was just going in and filling in that void, acting like he was king, kind of like low-level investment. making certain surgical strikes here, doing diplomatic coups here, using the social media power. He was savvy in that sense, and propping himself up as a counterbalance to the United States. Even the BS about him, being actively involved in Trump's life, that the Democrats stupidly propagated in the United States, thereby giving Putin more stature than he actually deserved. Putin was watching from the wings and saying, yeah, I'd like me a piece of that. Thank you for making me look like this world power that I'm not. And now all of a sudden I can use that soft power as leverage and create. Syria was part of that also kind of delegation of power the United States wanted to give. Make that your mess. And if you win with it, win with it. We don't care anymore. We're now focused on getting China in check because you don't matter. And Russia was building up and propping itself up as this superpower all of a sudden. He was selling it to his own constituency and making himself, make Russia great again kind of BS. And then in terms of, global South, this is how he expanded into places like Africa, right? We're now the serious contender. If you want to have a seat at the table, we're going to help you with that. Look at what we did with Syria. And then also this story about we don't ditch our allies. It's the Americans who do that. And now, the epilogue is just the bookend of this is so beautiful. Thank you very much, Putin, for ditching your ally. But anyways, at the time, he was gaining in soft power that he couldn't earn on his own. The Americans were doing it for him by just omission, but just taking out. Part of also what made the Saudis and the Emiratis go nuts in 2014, 2015. They sent a delegation to Washington trying to talk to Obama, offering him basically everything but the kitchen sink, right? Just stand with us against Iran actively, sell us weapons. And Obama basically said, we're always going to be there for you. We're always going to be your protector, but only once you get in danger. Otherwise, you're big boys now. You deal with Iran on your own. So a lot of what you see, you cannot divorce this from the context of American reduction in active presence in the Middle East. It has to do with the fact that the Middle East is no longer the source of lifeblood for the United States in terms of oil. America has now become an oil power in and of itself because of fracking. It became a player on the world market, no longer a consumer of Middle East oil, right? So part of that is also the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan and the end of American evangelism of state building and nation building, etc. The rhetoric remains in certain circles, but there is an aversion to wanting to be actively involved in anything with boots on the ground. It's not out of innocence. It's not out of, all of a sudden we've discovered Jesus. It's all about our interests will not be met
Absolutely.
by going into costly, foolish, futile, and thankless nation building exercises. We need to be the hegemon. We need to exercise this smartly from afar, be involved as much as we need to, where we need to, and just create something that is in our interest, right? So in the Middle East, in Syria specifically, that was the laboratory of this being exercised. And all the mess that you see is regional players who are still having a hard time adjusting to the fact that the Americans are not going to come anytime soon. The cavalry is not coming. They're not going to come for you.
I think your mentioning of laboratory is exactly what even the tankies don't understand, right? Because what they do is they take the timeline of American imperialism from post-World War II up until Iraq, and then they don't understand there was this moment where the US were... They did something very, very substantially different.
And I think, Ashfaaq, you were accusing tankies of understanding anything but this,
right? So just let me just let's take the premise.
Your benevolence is legendary. Really.
Let's take the premise, right? That there's this consistent U.S. interventionism, which is usually destructive, which is very supportive of the wrong actors in the region, and it's not that Syria is an exception. It's that in Syria, they kind of do this pullback moment. It's a global power is shifting, etc. And in many, many ways, if it wasn't for what's happened in Israel and for, that period when they bombed ISIS, which again wasn't, very little boots on the ground. There were boots on the ground, but very little. And it was just really cowardly strikes. They were very effective in terms of depleting ISIS, but they would be. They American airstrikes there's no counterpower to that in the region. But if it wasn't for this moment since October 7th, I think it's exactly the same. That this was their strategy. And to a large extent, one could argue it's still their strategy. They've just outsourced the thinking of this to Netanyahu, and they're just giving him guns. And clearly, they're not thinking beyond this. And we're going to get to the point where we start to make sense of the American posture now in Syria, right? Because clearly, Israel is misbehaving. And I think part of that is the US don't know what to do. And that part of that is, their misbehavior is kind of in our interests anyway. So it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if they upset Iran and they upset a bunch of people and deplete Arab society in the Middle East, because that's just more American action. But let's just now come back to Russia, yes. Because we kind of fast forwarded a bit, which I think is fine. But I think the Russian involvement is very important because it brings all sorts of new brutality to the war. And if anything, Syria was not pleasant before then, but that's when you see the massive influx of refugees within Syria and outside, where entire neighborhoods, cities are destroyed. Not that it wasn't happening before that, but the barrel bombing, the massive aerial bombardments. Just take us into 2015 up until about just pre-pandemic 2019, when there's a stalemate between the various factions. And then we'll talk about Turkey and the YPG, or what's called the SDF as well. It's interchangeable acronyms, but yeah.
Yeah. So in 2015, if you were a Syrian, your social media feed, we're talking WhatsApp at the time, and Facebook Messenger, or the precursor
Facebook
to
itself, yeah.
Facebook Messenger,
yeah.
Right? By the way, the Syrian Revolution was called the Facebook Revolution. Syrians were behind the times. We didn't have Snapchat, or TikTok. So Facebook was the kind of communication tool that Syrians used to voice their leanings, express their allegiances, but also communicate with one another. On these social media feeds in 2015, invariably, from sort of like mid 2015, so like July, August, but more so in September onwards, people were only in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, the city, the main, major cities in Syria. Middle class, lower middle class, upper class were only discussing ways to get out of Syria, go through Turkey, trading the numbers of potential smugglers, exchanging tips on where to walk and where to take a boat, how much would it cost to do this, to do that. It was all exodus. That was everything anyone was talking about. Nothing but that. All openly on the streets of Damascus, through social media, asking people who you knew, elsewhere in Syria, what to do, where to go, what's the easiest route, how can you be received in certain... Because people were devastated by the war, like in terms of psychological destruction, my wife went back. I couldn't go back. There was a warrant on me, right? But my wife was, apolitical. She went back for the first time in 2016, right? The country was the city was completely void of everyone that we know almost. No one from our friends or neighbors, et cetera, was there. And when she went there, she couldn't sleep because during the day, even from afar, all you can hear was helicopter gunships firing every which where you go. Like these large projectiles being thrown from big guns on Qasiyun.
And this is in Damascus, right? Yep.
Damascus itself was unperturbed, but from Damascus to the outskirts, the regime was always bombing every which way you go. So people were devastated psychologically by living under bombardment. You get inured to it in a certain sense, but also it affects your spirit. Financially speaking, people were the upper middle class was sliding into lower middle class. Inflation was taking care of everything, devastating everything. Everything was out of reach, if it existed at all. You couldn't walk out on the streets of Damascus without being frisked or stopped or humiliated. Sometimes, most of the time, by Hezbollah fighters who were non-Syrian, who kind of condescendingly spoke to you and humiliated you at checkpoints. Iranians walking through the city, and I'm not talking about everyday Iranians. I'm talking about Basij, IRGC members, kind of lording it over, kind of like Israelis in the West Bank, if you want, for tankies, if you want that, right? They treated people in that kind of like condescending, holier than thou kind of perspective, humiliating, and so on and so forth. With a sprinkle of Russians now also coming and like kind of lording it over the place. So the major cities in Syria were under an occupation in all but name. It became impossible for people to live there. And that was on everybody's minds, just to get out of the place, to find not a better life, a life outside of this, because the country was going down the drains, and it was looking like it was going down the drains for the regime that started all of this to begin with.
And I mean, I just want to build on your point before you carry on. I mean, it also
Please.
is the moment where it's very clear that the opposition has been hijacked, that the opposition is fragmented, that there's no hope anymore. So
yes.
So 3 years, we've seen devastation, we've seen a lot, but there is this army. It's a bit fragmented, but it's kind of fighting for us. But now it's like, yes, as the Saudis are saying, see what happened to Syria. Syrians are saying, see what happened to us. Like our revolution's been hijacked. Everything's gone.
Of what was
it's
happening,
over. Yes,
Ashfaaq, had gone by 2015. The regime had managed to push this into the scenario that obviously it was not ideal for it. It would ideally want it to have maintained power without even having to resort to any of this. But since it had to, this was the least worst option for the regime, was for Syrian people to become spectators to their own revolution, killing the revolution away, making it into a civil conflict.
To the point where they became spectators to now their own destruction.
Right. And the narrative that it created, what you fear create, the narrative that it wanted to create, which is this was all terrorists, this was all foreign meddling, this was all these anti-imperialist forces that wanted us to go into Israel's direction. The Saudis who are lackeys of the United States, the Qataris who are Islamists, the Turks who are, traitors, and so on and so forth. This is the narrative that it wanted to be created, and now it could sell it to a willing audience, whether inside Syria, who were, for their own reasons, afraid of anything new coming, because the regime had sold them the narrative that the Sunnis want to eat you up, or to people in the West who wanted to see this through either anti-imperialist, lenses, and by anti-imperialist I mean anti-American solely, or people who were afraid of Islamists, right? Post 9/11 had been, rightfully so, by the way, but overblown, panicky, fearsome, kind of scenarios. This is why a lot of people on the Italian right, for example, started visiting Assad in 2015. There were people from the Alternative for Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, the far right party, started visiting Assad and using their social media platforms, which were not too far from being, friendly to, and I'm going to be very, very circumscript on this, RT kind of type of sphere of influence, pro-Russian basically, peddling this narrative of Assad being the last bastion of Western civilization against, these Islamist hordes, these, brown monsters wanting to take over all that's good and virtuous about, Western civilization, and so on and so forth. This narrative impacted Syrians who were now caught between a rock and a hard place. If we stay behind, we're going to, either die slowly, painfully because of hunger and lack of any jobs, or under the boots of the regime itself, or we're gonna die by some kind of attack from any one of these factions or the regime itself fighting against them just by chance. So the one thing that we had left was to run for our lives. And then we were received in Europe, not me, Syrians were received in Europe for a while, with benevolence. People were nice, etc. Because they were assuming, these are people escaping. They're like normal looking people. It's gonna last a couple of months and then they're gonna go back. And all of a sudden, they're not gonna go back. They were too brown for everybody's taste. They spoke a different language, had different cultural leanings, etc. And then all of this reignited the fear, the xenophobic fear in a lot of European societies that was being barely kept under wraps, or their own disagreements with their own governments that needed to find an outlet that was sharp enough for them to make an issue out of. And it was all about these migrants coming in and threatening our, cultural balance and so on and so forth. And we became again caught in between a rock and a hard place. We couldn't escape. We wanted to stay in Syria, couldn't stay in Syria. We escaped to a West that we thought had done its homework about, humanist, values and democratic values, and that were supportive of our struggle. And all of a sudden, we became a burden and persona non grata. Where do we go? Where do we go? We didn't come to Europe for tourism. We didn't come for Europe because we wanted to edge you out of low-paid jobs as Uber drivers. We didn't come here because we wanted to, Islamize you and hijabize every German woman around. If you had asked us, we wanted to stay in our neighborhood, but we can't. We were forced to. So Russia played on these dynamics that it helped create or foment to vilify Syrians who were against the regime by stoking fears that were pre-existent in Europe or creating them where they didn't exist. Working with populist, right-leaning, politicians or political parties that were on the margin, that were now going into, center stage politically because of our presence as, a brown, massive, dormant threat, right? And using that to create or perpetuate or justify the narrative that Assad himself has created as him being a beacon of modernism, secularism, fighting a horde of Islamist beasts coming to overtake anything that's good around this region or beyond. So this part, Russia was instrumental as part of its onslaught of soft power, coupled with a few bombardments of major cities and, aiding and abetting mass murder and stuff like that. But these are incidental,
I mean, I appreciate that you brought the Russian soft power part to this, because I like to think that I know quite a lot about Syria, and while I'm aware of it, I actually negated it as part of the interview. So thanks for that, because I wanted to focus on their hard power. We'll get to because it was very destructive. But before, I think part of dismantling, because we are here now, dismantling sort of this narrative that have been bought by bystanders, by the right and by tankies on the left. And by just even good souls right now who are just looking on at this with sort of suspicion, right? Who just don't have enough information. Obviously, this is all occurring, and it's again one of those weird ways, the sliding door kind of thing, that in many ways, the HTS could make its Russian Damascus because Israel has depleted Hezbollah, who were defending the grounds of Syria while Russia was defending the air, and they couldn't because they all caught up in Ukraine, right? But let's explore this and unpack the misinformation, right? So let's go to, you mentioned this earlier, that there's lots of various fightings occurring from 2012 to 2017 in the outskirts of Damascus, shelling. Let's focus on Yarmouk, a Palestinian refugee camp. Tell us what you understand about what the battle there was about. Unpack for us just the devastation that was wreaked by the regime and the genesis of how all of these things occurred, because I think it will clear up a lot of suspicions maybe by listeners or viewers who may still be a bit cautious or confused by the points you make.
So Al Yarmouk camp was the largest refugee camp in Syria. It housed at the time around 500,000 people, almost 60% of whom were Palestinians. So you're talking about northwards of 300,000 people, right? It was a thriving suburb of southern Damascus, southeastern Damascus. It was attached geographically to other areas, part of which was Sayyida Zainab, so the shrine of Zainab, Prophet Muhammad's granddaughter, that was considered sacred for Shia. And it was overlooking other neighborhoods, all of which rose against the regime. Al-Yarmouk camp was part and parcel of Syrians' revolt, civil revolt against the regime. There were mass demonstrations there that were met by severe police action, partly by the Syrian Mukhabarat, or the intelligence services in their various guises, but also partly by pro-regime, I mean, I'm giving them more credit than they're due, lackeys of the regime on the Palestinian resistance front. Basically, Ahmed Jibril, so the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, which was basically an offshoot of the PFLP led by George Habash, who didn't really see eye to eye with the Syrian regime. And the Syrian regime basically asked Ahmed Jibril, who was always a Syrian Mukhabarat member in the Palestinian fold, to basically break free of them. There were some of the worst elements in Palestinian, on the PLO and the Palestinian armed resistance of Israel. They were always considered Syrian regime lackeys. They were active in resisting Palestinian demonstrations very violently and from the onset, and basically telling the Palestinians, you stay out of this or you stay with the regime. So Yarmouk camp en masse supported almost all of it. I mean, a large part of people in Yarmouk camp supported the Syrian revolution from the beginning. When the outskirts of Yarmouk camp started being bombed by the regime, people in Yarmouk camp opened their doors, started allowing these refugees, these internally displaced people from the neighborhoods that were adjacent to them, to come into Yarmouk camp. This was considered betrayal of the regime. The second one was actively opening schools and medical centers and seeking to allow people medical access, but also sending medication to these neighborhoods that were being besieged or bombarded. This was also considered a betrayal. Basically, the regime, in order for you to understand that, Ashfaaq, and for our viewers to understand that, kind of appropriated the Palestinian cause as its own. The entire history of the Syrian regime's fight with Yasser Arafat, for example, and the PLO en masse was because the Syrian regime wanted the Palestinian cause to be a card in its own pocket, basically, to wield against Israel when it wanted to, or to use as a bargaining chip. So it needed no Palestinian independent or autonomous force to exist, except for it being controlled by the Syrian regime. So that's on the political side. In a demographic and geographic, but also like population sense, the Syrian regime was always kind of patronizing Palestinians living in Syria as, we're the ones protecting you, we're the ones giving you all the access, we're the ones who are best for you, right? So you need to be grateful and know who's your paymaster. So when the Palestinians in Yarmouk camp started saying, no, we're with the Syrian people, not you, the Syrian regime took this as a personal affront. The Palestinians were not grateful. So as ungrateful bastard children, they were punished accordingly. First by a bombardment from the big guns overlooking Qasyun Mount onto Yarmouk camp. Big, large 155 millimeter projectiles being hurled at the Yarmouk camp. And then active penetration thereof. And then, obviously, from the Sayyida Zainab side, from the Hezbollah and Iranian-controlled religious shrine area, which became also a de facto kind of HQ for Iranian and pro-Iranian militias in southern Damascus, allowing magically ISIS to penetrate Yarmouk camp so that they could either give rise to an ISIS control over Yarmouk camp and thereby justifying the harsher measures that the Syrian regime wanted to apply, or at least create some infighting so that it decimates. And it happened, like both things happened. Yarmouk camp came under siege for 3.5 years. Starvation siege. These are Palestinians, mind you. These are not Swiss citizens. They're not, Uyghur Chinese Muslims. These are Palestinians for whom, against the world, apparently, the regime had been fighting this global conspiracy because it was part of the axis of resistance supporting the Palestinians. The Palestinians killed inside Yarmouk camp were more than anything up until Gaza that Israel had killed in its entire wars against the Arab world. The Syrian regime was beating the Israelis to killing Palestinians in terms of sheer numbers. And we were supposed to just basically bite our lip and stop because we didn't understand what the Palestinian cause was. It was white tankies living in the United States and the West who knew better about what was happening to Palestinians. We'll get to that a bit later. But what was happening in that sense was a mass killing, besieging, starvation of Palestinians in Yarmouk camp at the hands of the regime that was claiming that it was doing all of what it was doing, all its wars, all its starvation and stifling of political life of Syrians throughout the 5 decades in power, because it was doing it for the Palestinian cause. And it was doing it at the expense of and on the bodies of Palestinians living under his control, just because they supported Syrians in their justified claims for freedom, democracy, and getting rid of a regime that was stopping them from getting both.
Okay, I mean, I think what you said is very powerful. I mean, it's also very factual. But I think I just want to draw on a pattern, right? So what happens in Yarmouk plays out. Now, obviously, the timeline may vary, but it also plays out in other parts of Syria. It plays out in parts of Halab. It plays out in Eastern Ghouta for sure. It plays out in Madaya.
Yes.
And it's playing out in Gaza.
Yes.
Which is interesting. I'm not saying Netanyahu is in cahoots with the Syrian regime, but I think there's a good chance the Israelis would have done this independently of the Syrians ever doing anything like this to Bashar al-Assad the regime doing it to Syrians themselves. But it's really interesting because it's that same pattern. And just before this interview, we were speaking about the Hama massacre, which happens in February 1982, which is really horrid and far exceeded. Until Gaza and until the Syrian war. And maybe parts of that occurred during the Iran-Iraq war. It's probably at that time in 82 is probably the biggest atrocity by a modern Arab state against its own people. But again, it's interesting because that happens in February 1982, and the Sabra Shatila massacre happens later in 1982. I think it's about October or November. And so there's September. There we go. Right. So there's this consistent learning across the region, and I think what's lost.
How many Palestinians were killed in Sabra and Shatila, and not by Israel? They were killed by Lebanese forces, basically Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So the Phalangist forces of Bashir al-Jumayl, who were pro-Israeli. So the Israelis didn't get their hands dirty. They were just allowing, aiding, abetting, and watching from afar while Lebanese were killing Palestinians, obviously doing Israeli bidding, but the Israelis could claim, well, we didn't do it, right? So do you know how many people were killed in Sabra and Shatila?
It's about 2,000?
No, less.
Okay.
Less than 2,000 people. In Hama alone, in 1982, Assad had managed to kill anywhere between 15 to 30,000 people. It depends on whose numbers you trust. Even the numbers that pro-regime or kind of defenders of the regime were propagating, people like Patrick Seal, but other people as well, right? They were saying, oh, no, he only killed 3,000 people. He was northwards of Israel in terms of number of people killed on one occasion, right? Even if we were to trust the pro-regime figures that were kind of downplaying it. So you're talking about, as you said, a co-evolution and a co-learning. Assad was watching what Israel was doing, in terms of like besieging urban centers in the West Bank, how they did these kind of what they call makhsum in Hebrew, which basically are like these roadblocks that stop people, frisk them on the way, humiliate them, how you cordon off certain areas, how you threaten population centers, how you take people to prison, what you do with them, how you frisk them. The Assad regime was watching and learning. But then it did its own like kind of modifications, like its upgrades. And the Israelis were watching and learning. And then also, by an Arab regime doing that to Palestinians, in an offhand way, kind of sort of gave justification to the Israelis to do worse than they used to do. Right? I'm not saying there's an aiding and abetting in terms of like active... I get
what you're saying. No,
I'm not suggesting people are sitting in a room and saying, "Oh, you want to do that to the Palestinians. No, you want to do that to the Palestinians." It's just you're living in a neighborhood. You have the same kind of mentality on different aspects. Like you're both polar opposites of each other. But it sort of kind of happens that in certain aspects, your interests kind of coalesce without you even meaning it.
No, and it leads to this continuous decades-long dehumanization and cheapening of life. I mean, Tom Friedman, who we both probably dislike, and I'm sure most of our listeners or viewers would as well.
You mean the NYT?
The NYT Tom Friedman. Okay. I mean, he famously points to the Hama massacre as these are the things that happen in the neighborhood. There was an article he wrote very close to post October 7th where. It was a foreboding of this is what happens in the neighborhood, kind of excusing the impending atrocity that was, and genocide by many standards. I can't remember the exact date of when that article was written, but honestly, by October 9th, I think people familiar with the region already could see a genocide about to unfold. And it's just that consistent dehumanization. And I think it brings me to a question that I wanted to get to before Yarmouk, but I mean, it didn't make sense in the context of this. But the question is, trying to understand the mentality, and we've already touched on it, which is why I don't want to go into it, but now we can sort of just unpack it a bit more. Mm-hmm. The mentality of anti-imperial leftists who fail to see the Syrian revolution as, while we'll both agree and we'll speak about it in a moment, there's a lot of anxiety over what may happen in the future, but it's undoubtedly a huge human celebration. And just why is it that there's all sorts of, this is a CIA coup, this is an American victory, this is a Zionist victory, this is not in the interests of the Syrian people, when every image we're seeing, every soundbite we're hearing from Syrians say the opposite. What drives that mentality? I mean, we've spoken about it a bit, but let's build on that. What do you think drives this weird mentality?
Anti-imperialism to me is nothing short of a religious cult. It's an a-religious or anti-religious religious cult. By that I mean there's a dogmatic preset belief that there are good and evil, immovable objects, right? You need to put this as your structure and go and rigidly view the world through this. And it's a dichotomous, black on white, immutable, unchangeable, no degrees, no shades of gray in between, in terms of the conceptualization of the world. And it's justified by a moralist argument, which is sort of like moralist religious purists do it, especially the ones who are really extremists, right? My moral view is black on white. There's a definite good, there's a definite bad, and therefore I need to paint people into these boxes where they belong to either good or bad, black or white, right? And then I justify my worldview based on these players being this way, and I always see the white doing white things. Whatever they do gets whitewashed. So if my Nicolas Maduro kills a few people, it's because they're imperialists. It's because they're driven by the United States. The United States is imperialist. Imperialism is the root of all evil. Everything and anything that the United States says, I'm really happy about the people demonstrating in Venezuela. Oh, they're paid by the CIA. So Nicky Maduro, our boy, is only doing God's work, really, when he's killing off these people. And he's not even killing them. It's all propaganda. The whitewashing, the gaslighting starts. And it's all justified in the name of a good cause. I'm pro-Palestinian. right? I'm a white, tanky, pro-Palestinian, supposedly, right? Ashfaaq, I'm going to say an anecdote here, if you don't mind.
Please go for it.
Just a tiny little anecdote. If I can count the number of times that I've been stopped in demonstrations for Gaza or for Syria by white tankies who were telling me, the Syrian, who got kicked out of my own country, who still has family in Syria, who suffered, who knows people who died in detention, friends of mine. And this desktop white warrior, right, tells me what I need to know about Syria. I mean, the condescension, the paternalistic attitude, the chutzpah, the sheer, I can't find a word, but BS, right? That these people are capable of telling me what I need to know about my own suffering, telling me what I need to know about what is good and bad in Syria, telling me that I need to lose my home or my family because this is good for Palestine. What do you know about Palestine? You've just learned about it a couple of days ago in a meeting of your anti-imperialist league. And you have the cojones to come and tell me or other Syrians or other Palestinians what is good or bad for us, who's our friend or who's not. You're telling me that you know, because you follow democracy now, you know better about the world than me? And I'm a political scientist, mind you. I do this for a living.
And you Palestinian.
And I'm Palestinian too. And I am supposed to take this from a person with like zits that's just broken out of puberty, who doesn't know anything about the world. And they know better about Syria than myself. People like us, Ashfaaq, I'm not saying this to gain any sympathy, and I'm not saying this to get any moral, higher ground here. But we've been living with 13 years of pure and utter crap being thrown at us by people who don't know anything, claiming to themselves moral high ground, better understanding of the world, condescending, paternalistic attitudes, mostly male, by the way, in a supposedly progressive movement. Like Roger Waters. I'm a big fan of Pink Floyd's, right? Roger Waters does not have any right to go on stage and say the White Helmets are a CIA created organization. What do you know? What the hell do you know? Who did you ask? A couple of Instagram influencers who are, probably on the pay list of Russia Today or something of that sort, or just as misguided,
misinformed,
as you.
Yeah.
Just because they're brown does not make them understanding. Ask around. And if you don't know how to ask around, just please shut the hell up. Noam Chomsky was a big disappointment for me. Right? A lot of people who claim to themselves an anti-imperialist stance put us in a corner. All of a sudden, because we say Russia is not an anti-imperialist state, we became lackeys of the CIA. We needed to put ourselves in a corner and defend ourselves and justify what we were saying. This is, I think you can see the level of anger and frustration. We've been living with 13 years, having not only to deal with a daily grind of watching our country being destroyed, being deprived from ever going back, being worried for our families, living through a huge adjustment of life and limb in societies that do not want us. As Syrians, who only initially welcomed us and then all of a sudden started patronizing us for being there. We're part of the problem. We are the problem. We have to live with that and then live with the BS from people who know absolutely nothing about the situation we came from, telling us what to think, claiming for themselves the moral high ground. Even people like me who know what it means to resource and search for resources. This is what I do for my bread and butter. And someone who I wouldn't even accept as a student in one of my classes, coming to tell me a thing or two about Syria. That's chutzpah. That's what we've been living with for the past 13 years, man.
No, I completely appreciate your honesty and your anger, and I think
I'm really sorry for that.
No. It's please. I mean, the more expressive you are, the better. But I mean,
as a brown person, I reserve the right for that every once in a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just beyond brown people. But I think, I mean, what the comment I want to make is that I find this very interesting, but not surprising. That yes, you know, it's always a double injury. Firstly, there's the massive displacement and destruction that you have to see, and it's almost like on a visceral level, the robbing of your narrative about what happened to you sometimes is even more painful. It's like really weird. And I'm not saying it is more painful. I'm just saying it's after what's left, after you've seen destruction, your own voice is possibly the only thing you still want.
It's adding insult to injury. It's
completely
salt in our wound.
And it happens with most displaced, dispossessed. We see it happening. I mean, it's why the Palestinian issue raises the blood temperature so much, because there's this entire stripping of narrative, and in a weird way, because in a large way, Syrians have had to suffer that, but they've also had to suffer this narrative of robbing you of your own support of the Palestinian cause as common Arabs and common people, and people who are living, if not under occupation, dictatorship and horrendous, rule, right? So I mean, it's completely
it's the moralizing part of this, the self-appointed
absolutely
by anti-imperialists of all hues, but more insultingly by North American and European, non-Syrian, non-global South, pro-Palestinian, pro-global South causes. The moralizing and pontificating and holier-than-thou attitude that sells itself as, out of humility, because we're apologetic for our country's roles in the suffering of global South. We're going to become more gung-ho about this than you, and we're going to tell you what we want. And it's one of the things that happens with anti-imperialism is we belong to an imperialist nation as the United States. So we're the center of all evil. We're going to be, as white saviors, the center of everything that's good about this. And we're going to tell you what you need to do without saying it in so many words, but actively, basically becoming both the crux of the problem, but the resolver of this, by this absolving ourselves from the moral guilt that we've appointed to ourselves. That's not helpful.
No, absolutely. It's the taking the human out of the center and putting their lens and their narrative in the center. And it's a very dehumanizing thing, and usually it's very much about white saviors, and it's hence another form, if not maybe even a more at times irritating form of white supremacy. Okay, now let's move to the current, right?
Dude, good.
So, what do you think is going to happen to Syria? What do you make of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? What have you seen? So, I mean, it's already now been we're recording this on the 23rd, so it's been like 15 days. Since Mohammed Jalani is de facto in charge of Syria. Yeah. From what you've seen, what's your take on what's going on?
Well, first of all, in terms of very surface level observations, he's taken off his military fatigues to a suit without a tie to now a suit and tie. So
I've seen that, yeah.
Kind of like in terms of externalities and just surface level, he's trying to sell himself in a different manner. He's also now much more soft-spoken, much more talking in kind of conciliatory terms. The jihadi kind of rhetoric, the battle cries that were, voiced 3, 4, 5 years ago have now given rise to a wannabe statesman kind of attitude, talking about generalized peace and kind of Syria not being any nuisance to its neighbors, of Syrian society being multifaceted, that we don't want to impose anything upon everyone. Do I trust this? Is a tanky might ask, you're being so gullible and naive. Don't you understand? We're watching. We're trepidated. We're not completely trustworthy. But let me tell you the difference. It's a very simple but very stark and very profound difference. For 52 years, there was one single certainty in Syria. Things were always going to be shit. We only had Assad, and things were always going to go into that direction. We never had an option of things getting worse because we knew he was in control. Things were always going into one direction, which was slow or quick descent. Now, for the first time in 52 years under Assad, 61 under the Ba'ath, since 1958 after the union with Egypt, the start basically of military dictatorships in Syria. This is the first time that we have a toss-up between things going to the bad or to the less bad. I'm not going to say good. So I'm hopeful for the first time that we do have an alternative. We do have a potentiality of a different outcome from the shit that we always knew was going to happen. This in itself is a night and day, is a seminal change. Where do I see Syria going right now? I see Syria going in a different direction than authoritarian dictatorship that was North Korea on the Mediterranean, basically. Even Abu Muhammad Jolan, even Ahmed Sharazi now calls himself by his civic name, not his nom de guerre, cannot, even if he wants to, force Syrians back into the chicken coop like Hafez al-Assad did in 1970 onwards. He cannot do it. Syrians are done with this. It's no longer doable. It cannot be done. Now, will Syria become the beacon of progressive values like a modern or postmodern state where, LGBTQ flags can be flown and, civic values are highlighted, religion is kind of like a private space matter, everybody's living their own life and we're a consumerist society and, kind of like a westernized, democracy of sorts, having first world problems where, my Uber driver's late or, my union dues are, not paid or something to that effect. It's not going to happen anytime soon. Is it going back in the direction where it was? Definitely not. So what is going to happen? It's a struggle to establish at least the modicum of basic rights that were trampled upon by this regime. No unlawful detention, no disappearing of people, no violence en masse, no sectarianization of jobs in the security sector. No interference or exporting of local Syrian problems into the region by hegemonizing other people and creating these forever wars, or selling our muscle for hire for other countries like Assad used to do, the thug in the neighborhood. This in and of itself allows Syrians to showcase their ingenuity, their capacity to become, involved in business, in education. There are opportunities because there's such a dire need that predates, by the way, the 13 years of civil conflict and American-imposed sanctions. We were suffering prior to that because the regime had gutted Syrian life of everything and anything that is worthy, because anything and everything that is worthy was a threat, a direct threat to its own hegemony of society. It required a society bereft of ingenuity, of creativity, of discussion, debate, differences. Everything was subdued, and everything was controlled, and everything was gutted in order to maintain this family in rule. So what I'm looking forward to is the reverse of that. Will there be problems? Definitely. Do I trust HTS? Not particularly. But am I as fearful as others are right now? I'm thinking they're making some right noises, and they're making it forced by being forced to do it. It's not because I trust their own volition. By the way, I think they're making a genuine transformation over the past few years. But I'm going to discard all of this and throw it to the side and say I don't trust them at all. I think they're being forced to do that right now because they know that ruling over all of Syria's society and doing this for a longer period requires a different playbook. This gives me as a Syrian leverage over them as a de facto status quo power. This gives me negotiating space. This gives me the opportunity to have a give and take and not being able to be forced to do everything that they might have in their, wet dreams. So what we're looking at its worst, is going to be leaps and bounds better than what we had under Assad. And that is saying a lot.
Let's talk about the threats on the Syrian state that are not from within, right? I do wanna actually just poke the bear there, to use the term, and just kind of get more into what you said. You say you think they're undergoing some kind of change, and I think I wanna unravel that too, because I have a similar feeling, but I would like to have an informed discussion about that. But I think the just in terms of independence, right? Mm-hmm. So Israel are doing what Israel does. They've done at least 500 airstrikes on the country. They've expanded their occupation zone beyond the Golan Heights, and we're not sure.
500 airstrikes since when?
Since December 8th. So since Jelani has taken over, right? So thanks. I know it's important for you to make that. I get what you're doing, so thank you for that, right? So since Jelani's taken over, since December 8th, since Assad has fled, let's rather say that, right? 500 airstrikes. Fled. 500 airstrikes, a lot of them strategic but military. Is there fears that will extend beyond military? Not everything's been military, but where it gets to a point where power, water, all of these. And I get that a lot of the states already been sort of gutted out by the regime, but it is a serious concern. It will also foment a lot of stability. How do you read what the US may or may not do? Turkey are taking a lot of the credit, rightly or wrongly, for being behind this latest push. They obviously have direct concerns related to the Kurds in the northeast of Syria, the SDF and the PKK, who they for years have had a fight with in Turkey itself and in Syria since the war. What about the Kurds? Will they be able to be some sort of unity government will what is called Kurdistan in Syria be part of the government? Won't it be? Just all of these other externalities beyond what will HTS do, right? There's these other bigger questions. What's your thoughts on those things?
Let me start by telling you, I'm actually very watchful of the things that did not take place. I'm not looking at what happened. I'm looking at what could have or should have happened, but didn't. The start of the revolution, part of what we were talking about just a moment ago, well, more than a moment, but a bit earlier, was the meddling of the international and regional players in the Syrian revolt, creating an over-militarization, but also factionalization, and kind of creating or setting up or making or amplifying the civil part conflict in the civil war in Syria. Regional players have been largely hands-off in terms of the indigenous Syrian regime counter-regime forces balance. The Americans were hands-off in the sense, no boots on the ground, no military coordination. They were just looking, right? Obviously happy. It's in their interest in a sense. I'm not saying they're watching because they're benevolent or because they're Mother Teresa. So my tanky friends, if I have any, this is not being nice to the Americans. I'm not giving them any free pass. I'm just saying in terms of strategy, they were just hands off. They didn't care much about Syria. They had enough presence to protect the Kurds, and the Kurds were unperturbed, so they didn't need to interfere. And they were just watching and seeing if anything happened against their own interests, they would have nudged it in that direction, and only so much so. The Israelis, for the first few days, were just watching and seeing. After they saw the Assad regime fell, they took their steps, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute and describe their significance. The Iranians were completely thrown off balance. They were out of action. Thank God for that. right? Because if you're an anti-imperialist, Iran is a mini imperialist state in Syria. But that's another day. Hezbollah were also kind of caught off guard because Israel had cornered them in Lebanon, and they were completely cut off by Israeli bombardment of the Syrian-Israeli border, the Syrian-Lebanese border, from interfering in Syria. They didn't have the manpower to do it anyways, and even if they wanted to, they were completely thrown off balance. So Turkey was also kind of sort of there, sort of not there. And they were making sure that they will not interfere in a very overt or kind of like really heavy thumb, print over this. Maybe because they couldn't. But even if they could, I think they were trying to play this smart and kind of like watching from afar, leaving the indigenous part of this to take care of itself, and then coming and reaping the diplomatic rewards. So out of just pure pragmatism, if you want to be really doubtful about Turkey and you want to be really, really kind of cynical about things, the Turks played a very long game and they were being smart about it. The Saudis, Emiratis, and Qataris were watching and seeing. The Emiratis were actually actively on the side of the regime. They were the ones who rehabilitated the regime into the Arab fold. They were the ones that pushed him back into the Arab League. They were the ones who were most kind of like, diplomatically keeping him afloat and kind of telling him to, nudging him to kind of like play the long game and basically just voice that he was pushing the Iranians out so that they could rehabilitate him with the international community and the Americans. And they were not happy at what was happening. But they were also unable to stop him from falling. And they kept off. They were the only pro-regime, anti-HTS kind of thing, also because they don't really like the Turks becoming more powerful. But they were largely hands-off. So what was potentially the most dangerous part of this unfolding was the meddling from outside forces who, all for their own reasons, for the first time in the past 13 years, were actively hands off, in a sense of on the ground, assisting, aiding, financing, meddling, doing anything. The indigeneity of this fall of the regime made the regime fall quicker because the backing forces were completely out of bounds. The Russians were stuck in Ukraine and couldn't help him. They were also pissed off at him because they were pushing him to go and do a deal with Turkey, and he was rejecting their advances, trying to play, both ends of the game as he usually did. And they were actively angry at him for not listening to or heeding their advice. And they were too busy anyways. The Iranians, for their own reasons, and Hezbollah, as I was saying, were unable to help him. So he was bereft of allies. And all of a sudden, it's kind of like a castle of sand basically fell. There was only one big fight in northern Homs that really was kind of like sort of a last-ditch battle. But then Homs fell in like 48 hours, and Damascus just fell like a house of cards. So in this sense, what did not happen was international or regional interference in an active manner as it had been in 2013, 14, 15, and onwards. So this is big. This is big. It gives HTS's attack and taking over of Damascus, which was the seat of power and the capital city, in a very symbolic but also kind of like the nerve center of the entire country, a bigger importance, but it gives it also this unspoken but real, tangible, and felt legitimacy to the Syrian population, which all of a sudden became very important again after being marginalized by everybody, using them as pawns or victims or just, kind of getting them out of the shelf and, pleading, kind of for humanitarian assistance and then putting them back, into the shelf. We're now all of a sudden a force to be reckoned with, a political player in our own right. And we've given HTS's attack legitimacy because it was at least in all tangible senses for Syrians. Sorry, anti-imperialist tankies again. Syrians have a mind of their own. They don't get what you get. The Syrians themselves are, with their feet, voting for what has happened. They don't like HTS. They doubt HTS. Some of them actively are going to and started to agitate against HTS or any kind of overt Islamization of the public space. We don't know if they're going to be successful or not. But they all agree upon one thing. They liberated Syria from the regime. And they did it largely with their own hands, indigeneity. The perception of this is tangible in Damascus and other cities. Even if they do not like the people who did it, they know that it was Syrian hands assisted by Turkey, yes. But is it a heavy-handed kind of like Gaddafi-style NATO bombing where the external hand is really clear? Or the Americans, helping Iraqis topple the statue of Saddam in Firdos Square and basically being the force that removed the Saddam regime? No, it's not the same. So this indigeneity of that gives HTS some kind of goodwill, good faith, especially on top of which is their carefulness to make the noises that they're making in a conciliatory tone. For now, up until now, one of the other things that was not only a fear, but kind of like an almost certainty was the moment that the regime fell, because the regime had identified itself with the Alawite sect and basically put the Alawite sect, between it and the rest of the Syrian population in a very overt, cynical, really criminal manner, basically sacrificing the sect for its own remaining in power while depriving 95% of the Alawite sect of any kind of benefit. Alawites were poor, impoverished, marginalized in their own cities, and I'm not saying this to be kind of like a Mother Teresa again. This was reality on the grounds. People from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, when they went into the Alawite mountains, were shocked by the underdevelopment, by the 19th century style living that some villages and towns, main towns in the Alawite hinterland, were still living through, right? So by cynically positioning the Alawite sect as the main thrust of every shit that the regime committed, every crime that the regime committed against the Syrian population, what was going to happen in everybody's minds was, once the regime fell, bloodbath. People who were angry at what the regime did were going to take matters into their own hands and go en masse into Alawite villages and cities and start slaughtering people, Tutsi, Hutu Tutsi style, right? Rwanda style, like machetes and stuff like that. None of this happened. None of this happened. Were there incidents? Are there growing incidents? Yes. But is there the en masse, like entire city blocks moving onto the mountains and dragging people out of their houses, raping, pillaging, killing? None of this has happened. Partly it was because Syrians realized, if we do this, we're going to go into another Iraq or Libya. We don't want to do this.
I mean, you've already had it, right? You've had. I mean, there's that.
Not in our own hands.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Right? We're not going to do this to ourselves. So as condescending as a lot of Syrian analysts, but also Western analysts and pundits and anti-imperialists are against, looking at Syrians and down and saying, well, I mean, if you leave them to their own devices, they're going to eat each other for lunch because, they're not anti-imperialist or leftist. They don't have Frantz Fanon's booklets on their hands, or they don't read, The Invisible Hand of Adam Smith. Then they're ignoramuses and they're going to go into like tribalism as they usually do. They've been at it for thousands of years. What's going to change? And none of this happened. When the moment arose and every reason was there for people to be at each other's throats, none of this has happened. It's been 15 days now, and none of this has happened. On top of which, the HTS, the jihadis, the people who came, the Al-Qaeda offshoot, there are an Al-Qaeda offshoot, were also striking a conciliatory tone, stressing that there will be no mass punishment of anybody. Even if they're voicing it only, even if they're disingenuous and at heart they're liars. Let's take the worst case scenario that you have, right? They're a bunch of liars. They're just saying it like Taliban and they're going to go and do it. The fact that when they had the momentum and the cover of chaos and we're just marching in, somebody fired at us and we had to burn an entire city block down. When they had the opportunity and the incentive to do it, they did not do it. They've been keeping their powder dry for 15 days. I don't know why they would do it out of their own volition. If they can do things in this manner that they're doing it without the interference of all the spoilers from outside, then I think we're looking at an indigenous situation where we might go to a soft form of kind of enlightened authoritarianism of sorts, right? Kind of like MBS style or something of that sort, where there's a leadership of an elite which says it's going to, kind of impact, but also grow and, inject some kind of modernity, an Islamized version of modernity in their wet dream, or kind of have to conciliatorily, talk to people and reduce that. But it might go into a non-democratic but non-authoritarian situation here. Or it might go into an inclusive kind of soft democracy kind of style of things. We don't know. It's a toss-up, and we're going to try and agitate for it and work with each other for it. Now, the one thing that we need is non-interference from the outside. You asked me about Israel. Israel, if you look at what it didn't strike regime forces. It did not go and strike any rebel forces or strike with rebel forces. All it did is, after the rebels took over, started to take off the weapons of mass destruction and large guns and rockets, etc., that the regime had amassed over the past 40 years under the guise of wanting to fire them against Israel. By the way, if you've ever had the chance to visit the Golan Heights on the Israeli side, like I did in 2019 after I became a Canadian, and visited my friends there, or on the Syrian side, as I did when I was in school, when they took us for these school trips to visit and look at the Golan from, the occupied Golan that we were going to free, right? You knew that there was not even a stone thrown over the past 50 years from the Syrian side on the Israeli border. The Israeli border on the Golan, occupied Golan Heights, was the most peaceful Israeli border, even more peaceful than the Jordanian border, even more peaceful than the Egyptian border. There had been these attacks by soldiers who were disgruntled or who wanted to free Palestine and went ahead and killed some Israelis on the Jordanian or the Israeli borders. None of that ever happened on the Syrian side. None. Not one incident. And I challenge anyone to get me
Just
one.
to be clear, from
none.
Syria going into Israel.
Zero. Zilch. Right? So all these weapons were stashed in their hangars and in their depots. And Israel didn't have any problem with them. All of a sudden, Assad flees the coup, and all of a sudden Israel remembers, you know what? We want to take out these weapons. Why? Why now? Why bereave Syria of weapons bought out of our own money, out of our own blood, sweat, and tears? Why now take them out? And not before that? Why not when the civil war was happening and Israel was supposedly, according to anti-tankies, all behind this? Why did they not strike while the iron was hot? They were striking Iranians, so they're clearly not afraid of the Iranians in Syria. They were striking Hezbollah every day and night. By the way, sleeping in bed with the Russians because they were coordinating with Hmeimim Air Base with the Russians. There was not one incident of the Russians being angry at Israel, enough to stop them from bombarding Iran and Hezbollah since 2015. So why now take out these weapons? because they didn't want them to fall into the wrong hands. Under Assad, they were in the right hands. They knew that they were only for show or for active use against the Syrians. Some of these short-range missiles were used by Assad to bombard the Qalamun mountains, the Nabk area, for example, Aleppo, during the siege of Aleppo, parts of Damascus or the Damascus outskirts. Never against Israel, by the way. The chemical weapons, which were supposed to be the kind of deterrence against Israel's nuclear capabilities, again, completely off with Israel, but used against Erbil in 2013 and then onwards until 2018. Douma, Khan al-Asal, Khan Sheikhoun, tons of usages against Syrian population, not once against the Israelis. So when the Assad regime that was keeping those against its own population and away from Israel went ahead, the Israelis didn't want to take any chances. So they went ahead and eliminated those. Right? And now all of a sudden it somehow is an Israeli conspiracy. It's always an Israeli conspiracy. It's always the Americans behind this.
But just to move the conversation forward, though, I mean,
go ahead.
Is there though, it is not in Israel's interest to have a stable sort of representative state in Syria, right? It's not in their interest to have any of their neighbors having some sort of representative anything, right?
No.
And so do you think the question really is like, will Israel be trying to undermine this new state? Obviously they are already. I mean, their strikes are already undermining it. But do you fear that they'd have some sort of, there's something else up their sleeve? Or do you think they'll be successful in undermining it in some other way? Or do you think they've kind of run out of cards? Do you think that depends on a lot of American compliance? Do you think the Turks won't let that happen? What's the counterweight to their interference?
So everybody right now, Ashfaaq, is running against the clock before Trump comes to power. Everybody in the region is trying to get their ducks in a row so that they can present a good, credible scenario to the Trump administration and get their approval to get their own version of things to their best interest happening. So the Israelis are trying, but the Turks are counter trying. The Turks' main interest in Syria is two things. Getting rid of all the Syrians that they have in Turkey so that they take off this kind of burden that was part of the Turkish politics, as you suggested, as you've seen in your own eyes in Turkey, living there for 7 years.
I mean, even that would be, it would need to be variable, because if all the Syrians just leave, even if it's over a period of like 2 or 3 years, the Turkish economy is going to take a hit. So it's going to have to be some sort of gradual.
Thank you for standing. I stand corrected. I'm saying a big chunk, sizable enough to score a political win for the AKP and buy Erdogan another time in power. Maybe a constitutional modification that allows them to run for another term in the coming few years, or at least solidifying AKP control over politics for the foreseeable future. By removing this stain on the AKP, you've allowed these strangers to come and destroy the fabric of culture of Turkey, etc. By removing at least 1 million or a couple of million out of the 3.5 million people who were like lower tier workers, etc., people who were not very high end in terms of like education, etc. You remove a lot of the pressure from Turkey, and you score a point. You say, see, us as Turkey, we've promised you that we're going to give you shelter until you could go back to Syria. Now you can go back to Syria, and you can so you buy yourself a lot of political credit. But the other thing that the Turks are worried about is the enclave of the SDF inside Syria proper, which is a thorn to their side. They want to eliminate any idea of Turkish autonomy, active Turkish autonomy, armed Turkish autonomy that could be a pre-state state. So now the SDF, which was always playing regime against Turkey, Turkey against regime with the help of the Americans, Trump has made it clear in his first term that he is willing to, in a heartbeat, remove the American support for the Kurds and leave them to their own devices. I think this time around, he's going to be more forceful with it, because Anyways, the American force that was symbolically keeping the Kurds supported was like 900 people, maybe 2,000 now. It's a minimal force.
I mean,
it's a
the support had a lot more to do with support via guns, not boots on the ground, right? So they were arming them and providing finance
arming and
like
providing them, but also political cover. Americans being on the ground in Syria was kind of like a flag no one wanted to touch. Now, with Trump in power, Trump likes strong men. Erdogan is a strong man with a strong case. He's always had the interest of removing the United States from Syria because he didn't care. It's one of those shithole countries for him, right? Why support the Kurds? They're not strong enough. I want to take these out. It's symbolic, etc. And then the Turks have more leverage right now. So the Kurds inside their northeastern enclave are caught between, a non-Assad Syria. Although, by the way, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jolani was very quick to say, we hold no ill will towards anyone. The Kurds are always a component of Syria. So making positive noises that we're not going to actively attack you. By the way, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham can ill afford right now to get into a military action against the Kurds. So there's no interest, there's no capacity to do that. But in terms of like leveraging, like they used to do with the Assad regime, the leverage is gone from the Syrian side. And now they're caught between this and Turkey in the north. So Turkey is going to use that to try and push them towards a concession, right? I think Turkey's going to get its pound of flesh in the coming few months. I don't know this for a fact.
And what's its pound of flesh, just to be clear?
Basically a non-autonomous Kurdish region. Maybe self-rule on like a local level, cultural representation, teaching Kurdish language, some kind of,
that, as you have in Iraq, and possibly also a buffer zone. I'm sure they also want a demilitarized buffer zone. Correct.
I think they're waiting for Trump for now. It seems like they're waiting for Trump to come and give them the okay so that they can complete so they have two non-contiguous zones in northern Syria that are controlled by Turkey directly, like 3 or 4 kilometers deep.
Yep.
I think they want to make them a little deeper and then connect them. So the corridor between them that is now not controlled by Turkey, they want to connect it. This way they get leverage. I think they're going to try to negotiate with any legitimate government, so after elections or some kind of like a constitutional reform, etc. With a central government in Damascus, they're going to try and get the Adana agreement, which, by the way, they had signed with Assad's father in 1998, the Turks, which allows the Turkish army to go 3 kilometers deep all over the 900 and change kilometers border with Syria, to chase terrorists into Syrian territory. I think the Turks will now use the leverage that they have to kind of deepen the amount of territory that they control, but also the amount of territory they don't control but have an allowance to go into to chase terrorists, basically into Syria proper.
It sounds like you're saying that Israel aren't going to really have a lot of chips on the table, but you never know because they are Israel and Trump-Netanyahu relationship, etc.
So Netanyahu is, so Gideon Sa'ar, the foreign minister, the Israeli foreign minister, a month ago was saying that we need to start talking to the SDF. So the only leverage that the Kurds might have is if they play footsie with the Israelis. Because then they would have leverage against the Turks. Now it all depends on Trump allowing this. I don't think Trump and Netanyahu are very good friends nowadays.
Yeah, I think it's the Erdogan-Netanyahu Trump game, and that will basically determine whether Kurdistan. And I say this with as much respect for Kurdish aspirations, but the truth of the matter is the state will be used by Israel and possibly the US to just destabilize Syria.
And it won't be the first
which is
time
the problem.
The Kurds become unwittingly pawns in a greater game that uses their legitimate demands for non-Kurdish reasons. They've done it with the Kurds in Iran back in the day, sold the Kurds out in Iraq to the Iranians in the 1975 agreement of Shat al-Arab. Saddam Hussein used a concession to Iran for him to basically lord it over the Kurds, using Halabja again in the 1988 war. So the Kurds have also been the victims of these larger powers using their legitimate demands to get them worse off.
Okay, so not the final question, but the penultimate question, right? You mentioned something about you have seen signs from HTS that there's some sort of transformation going on. Just in 3 minutes, just speak me through that.
I'm thinking in terms of like the way that they've treated minorities in Syria. They're taking over Salamiya
as rulers.
Completely hands off.
Yep.
Completely hands off. Inside Damascus, Aleppo, largely staying out of the Christian quarters, making assuring noises, allowing a demonstration in Damascus 3 days ago that was led by secular opponents of Islamism, part of which are true progressive secularists who were anti-regime and pro like modernization, etc. But some of whom are also pro-regime wannabe secularists who were allowed to go and demonstrate on the streets. I'm not saying this is a benevolent move. I'm not giving them the benefit of the doubt. I'm saying usually Islamist, jihadist, forces would never even allow this to be spoken. The fact that they're doing it in a deft handling of things, they're trying to kind of cajole or not interfere or try to send positive noises, even if only for public relations reasons, tells you everything there needs to be said about the dynamic of power in Syria right now and how much society has leverage over the new rulers. So this gap needs to remain this large. Society needs to come up and always constantly pressure these wannabe rulers so that they don't get out of hand or start gaining leverage and increasing the gap. For now, HTS is also interested in not alarming all the region, especially Arab players who are, afraid of Islamist spread. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar, who don't want to see an active kind of Islamist trend happening. Israel also, not allowing Israel to use its, fears from Islamists to meddle in Syrian affairs. But also Turkey, who does not want an overly advanced Islamist trend happening because it wants to be able to sell that also to the Europeans. So all of these are good ways of looking at how this can become little less fearful and a lot more manageable for Syrians and non-Syrians alike.
I mean, I think a lot of it's just the pragmatism of ruling and everything that comes with it, right? But I think there's also a larger point that these guys did go and they fought with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and this is a real thing. I mean, there was a lot of fighting going on, but I think that can't be neglected. Like, there's definitely there's definitely some ideological sort of motivations behind why that fight occurs. And fighting is a very serious thing. It's not, a disagreement. They were fighting. Yes. Just final question, and I'd love to speak to you again, and it's been a fantastic conversation, and thanks for your time. But we literally have about 2 minutes before just for the continuity of the discussion, I don't want to have to reboot the camera and everything else.
Yes.
I know I've asked you how you feel, but we can't ignore that you're the Palestinian part of your identity as well, right? And so how does it feel that this has been a very dark year for many people who've been seeing what's happening out there in the world? How does the two sides in you feel about what's happening right now? That there's a blatant, disgusting, horrible genocide happening in Gaza and in other parts. There's massive ethnic cleansing happening in other parts of the West Bank and everything else. With this amazing, surprising, blind spotted joy of Assad leaving Syria for Syrians. Just walk me through that.
Ambivalent. I'm conflicted. I'm of two minds. Part of me is watching with glee what's happening in Syria. Part of me is devastated for what's happening in Gaza. And two things can be true at the same time. two sentiments can live with one another. I could be as happy and ecstatic as I am on my Syrian side, and as devastated and decimated at the complete loss, not only of Gaza, the Palestinian cause has lost. It's on its last 2 feet. There is absolutely no political body to speak for Palestinian rights anymore. And that's devastating. We're looking at a complete annihilation of the body politic of Palestinian cause for the foreseeable future, and that is not boding well. The Palestinians are the net loser in this regional change that has happened post October 7. However, and I'm going to try to end on a hopeful note, as naive as I might sound, as happy-go-lucky, eat, pray, love, as this may sound to people who are very cynical and very doubtful. The one thing that the Palestinian cause has lost over the past 40 years was true indigenous, societal, active, capable, societal Arab support from surrounding Arab societies. Because the regimes that were ruling over these Arab societies took the society out of the balance, hijacked true indigenous support by Syrians, by Jordanians, by every Arab population surrounding Palestine to the Palestinian cause, and made themselves the arbiters of what is and what isn't supportive of the Palestinian cause. The retrieval of Syrians' right to rule themselves, at minimum for now, and the rebuilding of Syria will undoubtedly become an aspect of support to the Palestinians and their cause. Palestine and its cause is a matter of every Arab society and every Arab individual surrounding Palestine. One of the problems that I blame Palestinian national organizations, whether the PLO or the Hamas or anybody in between, was that they bought into, they propagated, they amplified this false narrative of Arab regimes being, or Iranians, or Hezbollah, or these posers being the only support left for the Palestinians. It is us, active individuals and societies and communities, that paid the ultimate price because we wanted to rule our countries and be a support to the Palestinians. We, retrieving our own rights in our own countries, are the only lifeline that Palestine needs and will get. So what looks like a hopeless case right now, with us retrieving our liberties, at minimum, would be light years ahead of whatever the Palestinian cause had, and that caused it being bereft of true allies right now, and the Palestinians paying the ultimate price. So we're going to be the supporters of Palestine that Palestine never had in the past 50 years.
Gamal Mansour, it's been a lovely conversation. It's been congratulations as a Syrian. Much. But also, I think this is for all of us that's been seeing the Middle East die and what's unfolding in Gaza. It is a somber thing, but yes, it's been a very hopeful surprise in this year of devastation. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.